That morning, I opened my banking application and stared at a zero balance. My son called 10 minutes later and said he took all the money from my account and sold my house to pay for his wedding. He told me good luck. I did not say a single word and just made one phone call. When the wedding day came, he realized he stole from the wrong man. My name is Lamar. I am 69 years old and a retired civil engineer. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe respect is earned and not demanded by entitled family members. I stood at the register inside a crowded gas station right off the interstate. The cashier swiped my debit card to pay for a cup of coffee. The terminal beeped a harsh, flat rejection tone. The young cashier rolled his eyes and pushed the plastic card back across the counter. He told me the card was declined. I felt a sudden heat rise in my chest. I knew I had exactly $180,000 in that checking account yesterday afternoon. I stepped aside to let the impatient line of commuters pass by. I pulled my smartphone from my jacket pocket and opened my banking application. The screen refreshed slowly. I stared at the bold black numbers on the bright screen, $0.00. A cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. I immediately dialed the customer service number for my bank. The automated system greeted me with a cheerful, robotic voice. I navigated through the menu prompts to check my recent transactions. The robotic voice confirmed an outgoing wire transfer for the entire balance of $180,000 had cleared just 1 hour prior. The destination was listed as an external private account. I hung up the phone. My heart pounded heavily against my ribs. I had saved that money over 40 years of working construction and civil engineering jobs across the country. It was the absolute safety net my late wife Yvonne and I had built with calloused hands and missed vacations. I stood in the harsh fluorescent light of the convenience store and realized my life savings had vanished into thin air. I shoved the phone back into my pocket and walked out the glass doors into the brisk morning air. My phone vibrated violently against my leg before I could even reach the driver's side door of my truck. The caller identification displayed the name Jalen. I answered the call. My son did not bother saying hello. His voice dripped with an arrogant swagger that instantly made my stomach turn sour. Jalen loudly bragged that he had just emptied my entire retirement fund. He reminded me that I had made him a joint account holder during my double bypass heart surgery 2 years ago. I had done that so he could pay my medical bills and manage the household if I did not wake up from the intense anesthesia. I survived the complicated surgery, but I never removed his name from the banking paperwork. Jalen then casually delivered a second devastating blow. He informed me that he had also sold my house. He used the durable power of attorney I had signed during that same stressful hospital stay. Jalen proudly stated that the real estate transaction had officially closed at 8 o'clock this morning. I stood completely frozen beside my rusted truck. Jalen enthusiastically announced that my hard-earned money and the proceeds from my family home were funding his luxury wedding with his fiancée, Megan. They had booked a 5-star hotel ballroom for the following day. He said Megan deserved a lavish celebration. He told me that her white family came from high society and expected nothing but the absolute best from him. Jalen then lowered his voice into a cruel, sneering tone. He explicitly forbade me from attending the wedding ceremony. He claimed my faded flannel shirts and steel-toed work boots would humiliate him in front of Megan's wealthy relatives. He told me I was a blue-collar embarrassment who simply did not fit into his brand-new high-class world. He suggested I find a cheap motel room with the loose change in my pocket and hung up the phone abruptly. I stood alone in the empty parking lot. The sheer audacity of his ultimate betrayal washed over me in heavy waves. He had stripped me of my home and my financial security simply to impress a woman who looked down on our family history. I did not shout into the dead cellular receiver. I did not throw my phone across the hard asphalt parking lot. I calmly slid the device into my pocket and opened the heavy metal door of my old truck. I climbed into the worn driver's seat and gripped the leather steering wheel tightly. I did not shed a single tear over the stolen money. Yvonne and I had shed enough tears building that financial nest egg, and I absolutely refused to waste another single drop on an ungrateful son. My mind shifted instantly from initial shock to cold calculation. I leaned over the center console and popped open the locked glove compartment. I pushed aside old vehicle maintenance receipts and tire pressure gauges. I pulled out a heavy leather-bound planner. Yvonne had bought me this specific planner a decade ago to organize our most sensitive legal documents. I unzipped the dark leather casing and flipped past the standard emergency contacts. I ran my index finger down a very specific list of private numbers. Jalen believed I was just an ignorant old construction worker who barely understood modern banking and real estate law. He assumed my silence over the years was a sign of intellectual weakness. He assumed the power of attorney gave him absolute untouchable control over my entire existence. He failed to realize that I had spent 40 years managing massive city infrastructure projects and dealing with cutthroat municipal contractors. I knew exactly how to build a fortified structure, and I knew exactly how to demolish one with surgical precision. I found the business contact card I needed tucked into the back hidden flap of the planner. I picked up my phone again and dialed a secure private line. The call rang twice before a crisp voice answered the connection. I spoke directly to Mr. Hayes. He was my private wealth attorney and the sole executor of my hidden estate. I did not bother with morning pleasantries or small talk. I ordered Hayes to immediately initiate Protocol Directive 4. This legal directive specifically pertained to the hidden federal tax liens attached to the very property Jalen had just sold. I smiled coldly as I stared out the cracked windshield of my truck. Jalen thought he had executed the perfect financial crime by selling a house right out from under his elderly father. He had absolutely no idea that the property sat on federally protected land tied to a strict government grant in Yvonne's name. Selling that house without federal approval was a direct violation of United States law that triggered an automatic institutional freeze. Jalen had not stolen a simple retirement asset to pay for a party. My ambitious son had just stolen a federal trap, and the steel jaws were about to snap completely shut on his perfect wedding weekend. I pulled my rusted truck into the driveway of the house Yvonne and I built from the ground up. The gravel crunched under my tires. 2 massive private security guards in black tactical gear stood on my front porch. A slick real estate agent in a cheap tailored suit flanked them. He held a clipboard tight against his chest. I cut the engine and stepped out. The agent did not offer a greeting. He marched down the concrete steps and shoved a crisp white document directly into my chest. I grabbed the paper before it hit the dirt. It was a formal eviction notice. The agent sneered and ordered me to vacate the premises in exactly 1 hour. He stated that the new property owners demanded immediate possession. I scanned the top of the legal document. The listed buyer was not a family or an individual. It was a faceless corporate entity registered under a generic string of numbers and letters. The agent crossed his arms and told me the transaction had closed at 8 o'clock sharp. He threatened to have his security team forcibly remove me if I caused any trouble. He looked at my faded work boots and scoffed. He clearly assumed I was just a confused old man who had fallen behind on a reverse mortgage. I kept my face entirely blank. I did not raise my voice or argue about my rights. 40 years of managing hostile municipal contractors taught me that arguing with the executioner only wastes breath. I read the fine print on the eviction notice. The corporate entity claimed absolute jurisdiction over the lot. The agent tapped his expensive watch. He warned me the clock was ticking. He instructed the 2 guards to follow me inside and monitor my packing. They stepped forward with their hands resting on their utility belts. I folded the eviction notice neatly and slipped it into my jacket pocket. I walked past the agent without making eye contact. I ascended the porch steps and pushed open my own front door. The guards trailed heavily behind me. They invaded the sacred space where I had raised my son. They tracked mud onto the hardwood floors Yvonne had polished every Sunday. I felt a cold surge of anger, but I locked it away. I needed total clarity for what came next. I stopped in the middle of the living room and pulled the eviction notice back out. Attached to the back of the packet was a copy of the expedited deed transfer. I focused my eyes on the bottom right corner of the page. The signature line bore my name in dark ink. It was an absolute masterpiece of deception. The loops and hard angles mimicked my handwriting flawlessly. However, it lacked one crucial detail. Whenever Yvonne and I signed official documents, we always added a tiny subtle cross stroke at the tail end of the last letter. It was our private security measure against corporate fraud. That specific cross stroke was completely missing. A sudden realization hit me like a physical blow. Jalen did not use the durable power of attorney I gave him during my hospital stay. Using the power of attorney would have required a mandatory 30-day escrow holding period under state law. Jalen needed the cash instantly to fund his extravagant wedding tomorrow. To bypass the legal waiting period, my son committed outright felony forgery. He faked my signature to execute a rapid cash sale to a corporate buyer. This completely exposed his absolute financial desperation. He was willing to risk a federal prison sentence just to impress Megan and her elitist family. I stared at the forged ink on the paper. Jalen thought he was a brilliant criminal mastermind. He failed to understand that forgery automatically invalidated the entire chain of title from top to bottom. He handed me the exact weapon I needed to absolutely dismantle his life. I slipped the document back into my pocket and turned away from the guards. I knew exactly what my next move had to be. I did not fight the heavy-set security guard standing in my hallway. I walked straight into my master bedroom. The guards stood firm at the doorframe with their thick arms crossed over their chests. I pulled a single faded canvas duffel bag from the top shelf of my closet. I did not pack framed photographs or sentimental keepsakes. I only packed 3 changes of clothes and my essential daily medications. I walked over to the oak nightstand beside the bed I once shared with Yvonne. I knelt on the carpet and reached for the electrical wall socket located just above the wooden baseboard. I pulled a small flathead screwdriver from my pocket and quickly removed the plastic faceplate. I reached into the hollow cavity inside the wall and extracted a small encrypted flash drive. I slipped it securely into my inner jacket pocket. That tiny digital drive held the original architectural blueprints of the entire property. More importantly, it contained the certified digital copies of the federal land grant documents. Yvonne had secured that specific federal grant 20 years ago to protect the surrounding wetlands from corporate development. The government grant explicitly prohibited any commercial sale of the property without direct authorization from federal authorities. Jalen had absolutely no idea those legal documents even existed. I zipped up my canvas duffel bag and stood up. I looked around the quiet bedroom one last time. I felt no sorrow leaving the physical structure behind. The real power was safely secured inside my jacket pocket. I walked past the silent guards and headed straight for the front door. I was ready to leave the premises on my own terms. The trap was fully set, and I just needed to let my arrogant son step directly into it. I stepped off the porch and walked toward my truck. The real estate agent tauntingly locked the front door behind me. He jingled the shiny new brass keys in his hand with a triumphant smirk. I opened my truck door and threw my duffel bag onto the passenger seat. My phone suddenly buzzed violently in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw a new text message from Megan. I opened the notification. The screen displayed a high-resolution picture of a massive diamond necklace resting against her collarbone. The text beneath the photo read, "Thank you for the generous involuntary contribution to my big day." She actually believed she had won. She thought mocking a displaced old man was a clever victory lap. I did not reply to her cruel message. I did not let anger cloud my judgment. I simply tapped the forward button on the image. I typed in the direct email address for the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. I attached the photo of the diamond necklace alongside the forged deed transfer document. I hit send. The federal audit was officially triggered. Megan had just provided the government with photographic evidence of her stolen assets. I sat across from Mr. Hayes in his dim, wood-paneled office on the 14th floor of a downtown corporate building. He did not offer me a sympathetic smile or a cup of coffee. He knew my temperament perfectly well. We had spent the last decade securing my investments, and he understood that I only valued cold, hard facts. Hayes spread a thick stack of printed bank statements across his mahogany desk. The black ink on the white paper detailed the exact execution of my son's ultimate betrayal. Hayes tapped a silver pen against the top document. He confirmed that the entire $180,000 had been drained in 3 separate rapid wire transfers. Jalen had moved fast. The first wire sent $50,000 to an elite high-end catering company located in the wealthiest district of the city. The second wire pushed $30,000 directly to the luxury hotel to secure the grand ballroom and bridal suites for tomorrow. The remaining $100,000 did not go to a florist or a live band. Hayes pointed to a string of international routing numbers. The bulk of my life savings had been wired directly into a corporate offshore account registered in the Cayman Islands. A heavy silence settled in the room. Planning a luxury wedding was one thing, but sending 6 figures offshore meant something far more sinister was occurring. Jalen was not just an entitled groom throwing an expensive party. My son was being used as a financial mule. He was laundering stolen money across international borders right under my nose. I stared at the Cayman Islands routing code. Jalen had always been terrible with complex finances. He could barely balance his own checkbook or manage his monthly auto loans. There was absolutely no way he engineered an international wire transfer to a shell corporation on his own. Someone else pulled the strings. Someone orchestrated this massive theft and convinced my naive son that he was acting independently. I leaned forward in my leather chair. I demanded Hayes trace the exact ownership of that offshore account immediately. I needed to know exactly who was standing behind my son and guiding his hand into the federal fire. Hayes reached for his desk phone and strongly urged me to call the local police department right now. He insisted we could file a grand larceny report and have Jalen arrested before the rehearsal dinner even started. I reached across the desk and pressed my hand down on the telephone receiver. I explicitly refused his suggestion. Calling the local authorities would only result in state-level theft charges. A slick defense attorney would easily spin the narrative. They would claim it was a simple family misunderstanding over a joint checking account. Jalen would receive a slap on the wrist and a few months of probation. I wanted maximum accountability. I informed Hayes that local police lacked the proper jurisdiction to handle the real crime committed this morning. Hayes looked thoroughly confused. I quickly explained the true nature of the property Jalen had just fraudulently sold. The house did not just sit on a standard residential lot. Yvonne and I specifically built our home on the edge of a federally protected wetland. 20 years ago, Yvonne secured a highly restricted government conservation grant to subsidize the land. The federal government maintained a permanent active stake in the property title. Selling that specific parcel of land without a comprehensive federal environmental review and direct authorization from Washington was not a simple real estate violation. It constituted a severe federal felony. Jalen had unwittingly committed real estate fraud against the United States government. The penalty for tampering with a federal conservation asset carried a mandatory federal prison sentence. I told Hayes to drop the local police idea immediately because the federal authorities would be taking over this case. I needed to know exactly who bought the house so I could burn them down alongside my son. Hayes quickly pulled his hands away from the phone and turned his attention back to his dual computer monitors. His fingers flew across the keyboard as he accessed the highly restricted public business registry. He pulled up the deed transfer Jalen had forged earlier today. He cross-referenced the generic corporate entity that purchased my house against state tax records. The screen loaded a massive web of subsidiary companies and limited liability corporations. Hayes isolated the parent company and pulled up the primary executive officer. The name Arthur glowed brightly on the screen. My chest tightened. Arthur was Megan's father. Jalen had constantly bragged about Arthur's massive wealth and his elite social status. Megan had always paraded around our home carrying designer bags and talking down to me like a peasant. The truth was now glaringly obvious. The registry displayed a dark history of financial ruin. Arthur's primary business holdings had faced total bankruptcy 3 separate times in the last 5 years. His current commercial properties were drowning in heavy foreclosure notices. Megan's family was not wealthy at all. They were entirely broke. They were nothing but high society scavengers surviving on predatory credit and elaborate lies. Arthur had recognized Jalen as an incredibly easy target. He used his daughter to manipulate my son into liquidating the only real asset our family possessed. Arthur orchestrated the fake real estate purchase to steal my house and funnel the remaining cash into his offshore Cayman account. Jalen was effectively financing the survival of a bankrupt family while completely destroying his own flesh and blood. Arthur had played my son for an absolute fool, but Arthur had made a fatal miscalculation by underestimating my reach. Hayes spun his monitor around to show me the full extent of Arthur's catastrophic corporate debts. He immediately offered to contact the bank and freeze all the outgoing wedding accounts to salvage the remaining deposits. I stood up from the leather chair and buttoned my jacket. I flatly denied his request. I explicitly instructed Hayes to let every single wedding check clear the bank. I wanted the elite catering company paid in full. I wanted the grand hotel ballroom secured without a hitch. I wanted Arthur and Megan to feel an absolute sense of untouchable victory tonight. Freezing the accounts right now would allow them to quietly cancel the event and hide their massive humiliation behind closed doors. I refused to grant them a private escape. They had stolen my life savings to throw a highly publicized luxury wedding for their elite social circle. I intended to give them exactly what they paid for. I wanted the entire financial collapse to happen publicly right at the altar in front of every single person they were trying to impress. I thanked Hayes for his time and walked out of his office. The trap was fully loaded and I needed to watch them step into it. I parked my rusted truck across the street from the most exclusive bridal boutique in the financial district. The massive storefront windows were spotless and framed in gold. I sat behind the steering wheel and watched the scene unfolding inside. Megan and her mother lounged on plush velvet sofas. They held crystal flutes filled with expensive champagne. Dozens of heavily embellished designer dresses hung around them like trophies. Assistants scurried back and forth to cater to their every whim. They looked like royalty enjoying the spoils of a conquered kingdom. The sick reality was that my life savings funded every sip of that champagne. I did not let anger cloud my vision. I picked up my phone and dialed a private investigator I had contracted during my corporate engineering days. I gave the investigator a single directive. I needed a complete financial background check on Arthur Megan's father. I needed every tax return, every court filing, and every corporate ledger attached to his name. I knew Arthur operated a shell company to buy my house. I needed to know exactly why he resorted to such a desperate, illegal maneuver. The investigator promised to deliver the dossier within the hour. I leaned back against my cracked leather seat. I kept my eyes fixed on the boutique window. Megan threw her head back and laughed at something her mother said. She raised her glass in a toast. I watched her celebrate her supposed victory. She had no idea I was sitting just 50 feet away, holding the match that would burn her fake empire to the ground. My phone chimed with a secure email notification just 45 minutes later. The investigator worked fast. I opened the encrypted file and scrolled through the attached documents. The truth about Megan's family was laid bare in harsh black and white text. Arthur had filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy 3 separate times over the last decade. His construction supply business was a hollow front drowning in debt. His credit score was entirely non-existent. But the most damning piece of evidence was a series of intercepted invoice copies from the wedding vendors. I scrutinized the numbers. Megan was paying exactly double the standard market rate for the catering, the floral arrangements, and the luxury hotel ballroom. The investigator had attached a note explaining the discrepancy. The entire wedding was an elaborate money laundering scheme. Megan and Arthur had negotiated secret kickback deals with every single vendor. They overpaid using the $180,000 stolen from my account. The vendors processed the inflated payments and then handed the cash difference back to Arthur under the table. They were washing my stolen retirement funds right in front of everyone. Jalen was completely oblivious to the scam. My son believed he was funding a fairy tale wedding for a high society bride. He thought he was buying his way into an elite white family. Instead, he was acting as the unwitting financial mule for a syndicate of broke con artists. They were bleeding him dry and laughing behind his back. Jalen had sacrificed his own father for a woman who viewed him as nothing more than a gullible cash machine. The sheer scale of the manipulation was staggering. Arthur had orchestrated the fake real estate purchase to secure the initial cash. Now his daughter was executing the final phase of the theft by funneling the money through fake wedding expenses. I locked my phone screen. My son had betrayed me, but he was also walking blindly toward his own absolute destruction. I stared at the dashboard. Jalen always desperately wanted to fit in with the wealthy crowd. He hated my calloused hands and my faded work boots. He traded his family legacy for an illusion of grandeur. Now he was about to face federal wire fraud charges for a family that would discard him the second his bank account hit zero. The trap they built for him was flawless. They used his insecurity against him. I had to decide whether to let him hang or force him to see the brutal truth. The glass door of this boutique swung open. Jalen stepped out onto the sunlit sidewalk. He struggled under the weight of a dozen massive shopping bags stamped with high-end designer logos. His tailored suit jacket was wrinkled and sweat glistened on his forehead. Megan strutted out right behind him. She did not carry a single item. She held her phone in one hand and her half-empty champagne flute in the other. Jalen paused near the curb to adjust his grip on the heavy bags. Megan stopped and glared at him. She actually snapped her fingers at my son. She barked a sharp order for him to hurry up and open the trunk of her leased luxury sedan. Jalen did not stand up for himself. He did not demand respect. He just lowered his head and meekly scurried toward the car like a terrified servant. He fumbled with the keys while trying to balance the towering stack of boxes. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I watched the boy I raised abandon every ounce of his pride for a woman who was actively robbing him blind. I spent my entire life teaching him to stand tall and demand respect in a world that would try to break him down. I worked double shifts to pay for his college education so he would never have to bow his head to anyone. Now he was voluntarily subjugating himself to a manipulative thief who secretly despised him. The sight sickened me more than the stolen money ever could. He shoved the last bag into the trunk and slammed it shut. Megan did not thank him. She merely pointed to the driver's seat and ordered him to start the engine. Jalen wiped his brow and rushed to open her door first. He was trapped in a prison of his own making. I could not sit in the shadows any longer. I pushed open the heavy door of my truck and stepped out onto the busy street. I crossed the asphalt and walked directly toward the luxury sedan. My steel-toed boots hit the concrete sidewalk with a heavy, rhythmic thud. Megan was just about to slide into the passenger seat when she glanced up. Her eyes locked onto my faded flannel shirt and my worn denim jeans. Her expression instantly twisted into a mask of pure disgust. She did not recognize me as the man whose money bought the very clothes on her back. She nudged Jalen hard in the ribs and pointed a manicured finger in my direction. She loudly demanded to know why a filthy homeless man was approaching her vehicle. Jalen turned around. All the blood immediately drained from his face when he recognized me. Megan did not wait for his answer. She snapped her fingers again. This time she signaled the boutique security guard standing by the door. She ordered the guard to remove the trash from her sidewalk before it ruined her perfect wedding mood. The security guard outside the boutique lunged forward to grab my shoulder. I simply shifted my weight and let his own momentum carry him stumbling past me. I completely ignored his shouted threats. I walked straight past the storefront and pushed through the heavy brass revolving doors of the adjacent luxury hotel. The venue chosen for my son's wedding was a towering monument to absolute financial excess. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings painted with intricate frescoes. The floors were pristine, polished Italian marble. I marched across the vast lobby with the heavy, rhythmic thud of my steel-toed work boots echoing against the stone. Wealthy guests in bespoke suits and designer evening wear actively parted to make way for the old man in faded denim and a worn flannel shirt. I walked directly to the primary concierge desk. A sharp man in a fitted tuxedo stood behind the sprawling mahogany counter. A polished gold nameplate identified him as the executive event manager. He looked up from his sleek computer monitor. His perfectly groomed eyebrows immediately pinched together in a display of absolute disdain. He took one single look at my calloused hands and instantly classified me as a trespassing vagrant. He raised a manicured hand and opened his mouth to summon the lobby security detail. I did not give him the opportunity to speak a single word of dismissal. I reached into my inner jacket pocket and extracted a thick embossed business card. I slapped it down hard on the polished mahogany surface right over his keyboard. The heavy black cardstock bore the intimidating silver eagle logo of the premier federal financial auditing firm in the state. I had consulted for their forensic division for 15 years, verifying municipal construction budgets and exposing corrupt civic contractors. The silver foil lettering carried undeniable federal authority. I told the manager I was conducting an active financial review of a specific client holding an event on his premises. I leaned my weight forward and rested my heavy knuckles on his pristine desk. I instructed him to look very closely at the credentials. I informed him that any failure to cooperate with a preliminary federal inquiry would result in an immediate operational freeze of his entire hospitality establishment. The manager stared down at the Silver Eagle logo. All the arrogant color instantly drained from his face. His manicured hand trembled as he carefully picked up the business card to inspect the watermark. He swallowed hard and immediately dropped his elitist attitude. He addressed me as sir and frantically typed his administrative password into the computer system. I demanded to see the complete payment ledger for Jalen and Megan's wedding event. The manager did not hesitate or ask for a judicial warrant. He turned his wide monitor around to face me. He quickly brought up the detailed billing invoice for the grand ballroom reservation. I scanned the itemized financial data with practiced precision. The screen displayed a massive total balance of $150,000. The payment history showed an initial $50,000 deposit applied yesterday morning. I checked the transaction routing details. The deposit was paid via a direct wire transfer from the exact offshore Cayman Islands account Arthur was using to launder my stolen retirement funds. I scrolled down to the pending payments section. The remaining balance of $100,000 was strictly scheduled to be auto-drafted from that same offshore account tomorrow morning. I checked the exact timestamp for the scheduled transaction. The hotel accounting system was programmed to pull the final massive payment at exactly 10 o'clock in the morning. That was the precise minute Jalen and Megan were scheduled to stand at the altar and begin their wedding ceremony. The timing was an absolute masterpiece of arrogant planning. Arthur intended to let the final stolen funds clear the bank at the exact moment his daughter secured her legal marriage to my oblivious son. I instructed the event manager to print a hard copy of the entire billing ledger. I stood at the mahogany desk waiting for the physical documents when a loud, booming laugh echoed across the vast marble lobby. I slowly turned around. Arthur strutted through the main entrance doors. He wore a custom-tailored gray suit and walked with the aggressive, unearned confidence of a man actively spending someone else's fortune. He immediately spotted me standing by the concierge desk. A wide, smug grin spread across his perfectly tanned face. He abruptly changed his path and marched directly toward me. Arthur stopped mere inches from my face and looked me up and down with highly theatrical pity. He loudly mocked me for losing my family home to an eviction crew earlier this morning. He cruelly asked how it felt to be completely outsmarted by a superior intellect. He proudly boasted that his beautiful daughter deserved to be surrounded by high-class wealth and extravagant luxury. He boldly stated she could never survive on the pathetic blue-collar pennies I had desperately scraped together playing in the dirt. Arthur absolutely reveled in his perceived victory. He fully believed he had utterly destroyed my legacy and secured his own permanent financial salvation. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick leather money clip. He deliberately extracted a crisp new $100 bill. He folded the green paper and forcefully shoved it into the front breast pocket of my faded flannel shirt. He patted my chest with a heavy, condescending strike. He told me to go buy myself a hot meal and a one-way bus ticket out of his city. He laughed loudly in my face as a final, calculated insult. I did not flinch or react to his physical provocation. I maintained absolute eye contact. I calmly reached 2 fingers into my breast pocket and retrieved the crisp $100 bill. I held the green paper up between our faces. I gripped the edges firmly and ripped the currency perfectly in half. I let the torn pieces flutter down onto the pristine marble floor between his expensive leather shoes. I stepped closer to Arthur and lowered my voice into a cold, dead monotone. I informed him that the United States government takes a very severe stance on international money laundering. I specifically stated that executing a fraudulent real estate transaction and moving the stolen federal funds across state lines constitutes felony wire fraud. I told him that federal wire fraud carries a strict mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years in a maximum security penitentiary. The loud, booming laugh instantly died in Arthur's throat. His smug, triumphant smile vanished completely. The arrogant color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified old man. He stared down at the torn money on the floor. I turned my back on him and walked out of the hotel. I drove my rusted truck to a rundown motel on the far outskirts of the city. The flickering neon sign buzzed with a constant, dull electrical hum. I unlocked the flimsy door to room 7 and stepped inside the cramped space. The stale air smelled heavily of old smoke and cheap industrial cleaner. I dropped my heavy canvas duffel bag onto the stained carpet and walked directly to the bed. I spread the freshly printed hotel ledgers across the lumpy mattress. I carefully placed Arthur's shell company documents right next to the exorbitant catering and ballroom invoices I had just acquired. The dim yellow light from the bedside lamp illuminated the endless rows of black digits. I pulled a red pen from my jacket pocket and began to cross-reference the international routing numbers. I methodically traced the exact flow of my stolen retirement funds. Arthur was exceptionally arrogant, but he was dangerously careless. He utilized the exact same corporate architecture for both sides of his criminal operations. I drew a thick red line connecting the offshore Cayman Islands account receiving the wedding vendor kickbacks directly to the fake real estate firm that purchased my house this morning. The routing numbers matched flawlessly down to the very final digit. Arthur was literally paying for the fraudulent real estate acquisition using the exact same illicit account he was actively stuffing with the laundered wedding money. He had engineered a circular financial structure that was absolutely destined to collapse under any basic auditing scrutiny. I stared coldly at the red ink permanently linking the documents. The sheer laziness of the scheme deeply offended my 40 years of meticulous civil engineering experience. Arthur fully believed he was operating on an untouchable tier of elite high society finance. In reality, he had just constructed a remarkably fragile house of cards on a shallow foundation of easily traceable wire fraud. My cellular phone vibrated aggressively against the cheap laminate nightstand. The caller identification displayed Mr. Hayes. I answered the secure private line immediately. Hayes did not waste any time with standard conversational pleasantries. His voice crackled through the speaker with a sharp professional intensity. He rapidly informed me that he had just officially secured the physical copy of the original property deed directly from the county clerk office. He held the sworn document in his hands and confirmed my initial dark suspicion. Jalen had blatantly forged my signature on the title transfer. Hayes stated that the clumsy forgery was glaringly obvious even to an untrained administrative eye. My son had not even attempted to replicate the specific protective cross-stroke Yvonne and I had utilized for decades on all legal paperwork. The strictly fraudulent nature of the rapid real estate transaction was now an undeniable legal fact recorded in the county registry. However, Hayes had uncovered a far more destructive piece of information during his rapid forensic investigation. He aggressively dug into the deep historical archives regarding Yvonne's original federal conservation grant. He found a heavily buried protective clause embedded deep within the core federal land use agreement. Because the property sat on heavily subsidized and protected wetland, any unauthorized commercial sale automatically triggered a severe federal penalty. The precise moment a fraudulent transfer was logged into the county computing system, an unavoidable countdown officially began. The strict federal clause mandated an absolute and immediate Internal Revenue Service asset freeze on both the listed buyer and the seller. This catastrophic financial lockdown was legally required to strike exactly 48 hours after the unauthorized transaction officially closed. Hayes explained that the federal government would completely seize all connected bank accounts, corporate assets, and international offshore holdings tied to the illegal sale to prevent any immediate capital flight. The federal asset freeze was automatic, swift, and completely unappealable. Jalen and Arthur were entirely blind to this devastating federal mandate. They genuinely thought they had successfully bypassed the standard 30-day escrow holding period by faking a rapid cash sale. They had absolutely no idea their illegal administrative shortcut had aggressively armed a massive financial landmine right beneath their expensive leather shoes. I checked the glowing digital clock resting on the dusty motel nightstand. I sat on the edge of the mattress and mentally calculated the exact timeline of the impending financial destruction. Jalen officially closed the fraudulent real estate transaction at exactly 9 o'clock yesterday morning. The mandatory 48-hour federal review period would officially expire tomorrow morning. The sweeping Internal Revenue Service asset freeze would strike the global banking networks precisely at 9 o'clock in the morning. That was exactly 1 hour before Jalen and Megan were scheduled to stand at the altar inside the luxury hotel ballroom. It was exactly 1 hour before the hotel automated accounting system would attempt to draft the final $100,000 wedding payment directly from Arthur's offshore account. The timing was an absolute stroke of flawless cosmic justice. I realized I currently held the ultimate detonator in the palm of my calloused hand. I did not need to confront my ungrateful son or shout at Arthur in a crowded hotel lobby. I just needed to ensure the federal authorities possessed the exact target coordinates to execute the strike. I opened my encrypted email application and created a brand new secure message. I attached the high-resolution scans of the forged deed transfer. I added the detailed hotel billing ledgers and the matching offshore routing numbers that connected the entire conspiracy. I addressed the comprehensive digital file directly to the primary investigative division of the local Federal Bureau of Investigation field office. I purposefully included the specific reference codes for Yvonne's federal conservation grant in the subject line. I tapped the screen and hit send. The digital packet vanished into the ether. The unalterable chain reaction was now officially in motion. A sudden, violent pounding echoed loudly through the small, quiet motel room. The heavy, aggressive strikes rattled the flimsy wooden door violently within its cheap metal frame. I calmly placed my phone face down on the lumpy mattress. I did not rush or display any outward signs of sudden alarm. I walked slowly across the stained carpet and leaned close to the vibrating door. I pressed my right eye against the scratched glass peephole. Jalen stood out in the dim exterior hallway. His face was flushed, a deep, angry red with a volatile mixture of raw panic and intense, unhinged fury. His expensive designer suit jacket was entirely unbuttoned, and his silk tie was pulled loose around his neck. He clutched a thick manila folder tightly against his chest with white-knuckled hands. My son had somehow managed to track down my cheap motel room just hours before his lavish rehearsal dinner was scheduled to begin. He breathed heavily and looked exactly like a desperate, cornered animal preparing to violently lash out. I reached forward and slowly turned the brass deadbolt lock. I grabbed the cold metal handle and pulled the heavy door wide open. Jalen did not wait for an invitation. He pushed his shoulder past my chest and forced his way into the cramped motel room. He smelled faintly of expensive cologne and sour panic. He marched directly toward the small bed and slammed a thick manila folder onto the lumpy mattress. The pages inside spilled out across the cheap floral bedspread. Jalen turned to face me with his jaw tightly clenched. He pointed a trembling finger at the scattered documents. He demanded I read them immediately. I did not move toward the bed. I simply looked at the papers and recognized the standard legal formatting. It was a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement paired with a binding release of liability. Jalen commanded me to sign the bottom line right this second. He explained the terms with a fast, aggressive cadence. The contract legally required me to permanently relinquish any and all claims to the stolen $180,000. It also contained a specific clause barring me from ever contesting the fraudulent sale of my house. Jalen essentially wanted me to sign away my entire life savings and my home with a single stroke of a pen. I looked at my son and asked him what possible incentive I had to sign a document that left me completely destitute. Jalen puffed out his chest and attempted to look magnanimous. He stated that in exchange for my absolute silence and total surrender, he would graciously provide me with a monthly cash allowance. He offered me exactly $500 a month. He claimed it was more than enough to cover a cheap rental room and basic groceries for a man of my age. He presented this miserable, insulting figure as if he were granting me a tremendous philanthropic gift. He actually expected me to thank him for rationing out pennies from the massive fortune he had just stolen from my bank account. He crossed his arms and demanded my immediate compliance. He insisted that if I refused to sign, he would completely cut me off and let me starve on the streets. He thought he held all the power in the room. He had no idea his entire world was scheduled to legally self-destruct in less than 14 hours. Jalen began to pace back and forth across the stained motel carpet. The confined space amplified his agitated movements. He did not wait for my response before launching into a bitter defensive monologue. He aggressively justified his massive theft by weaponizing ancient grievances. He claimed he inherently deserved every single cent of that $180,000 as back pay for his miserable childhood. He wildly pointed his finger at my chest and shouted that I had practically abused him during his college years. His definition of abuse was my strict requirement that he work a part-time job at a local hardware store to pay for his weekend entertainment. He screamed that all of his wealthy fraternity brothers received blank checks and luxury vehicles from their fathers. He had to wear a retail uniform and sweep sawdust just to afford gas money. He harbored a deep, toxic resentment for over a decade because I refused to fund a life of unearned luxury. He spat the words at me with genuine venom. This financial betrayal was not just a desperate measure to fund his high society wedding with Megan. It was a calculated act of profound petty vengeance. He wanted to financially cripple me, specifically because I had forced him to learn the value of hard labor. He viewed my blue-collar discipline as a direct insult to his perceived elite status. He paced the room and proudly declared that taking my house and my retirement fund was simply balancing the scales of justice. He genuinely believed that stripping an old man of his lifetime of hard work was his divine birthright. I did not argue with his deranged logic. I did not raise my voice or waste my breath trying to explain the fundamental concepts of integrity and hard work to a man who had already fully justified his own criminal behavior. Arguing with a narcissist only validates their twisted reality. I walked slowly toward the bed and picked up the cheap plastic pen resting next to the scattered legal documents. I leaned my weight over the mattress and pressed the tip of the pen against the signature line of the final page. I quickly dragged the dark ink across the white paper. I stood up straight and took a deliberate step back from the bed. Jalen practically lunged forward and snatched the contract off the mattress. He scrutinized the ink with wide, greedy eyes. A massive, triumphant smile stretched across his flushed face. He exhaled a long, heavy breath of absolute relief. He truly believed he had just completely neutralized the only active threat to his perfect wedding weekend. He quickly folded the thick documents and shoved them back into the manila folder. He looked at me and openly mocked my rapid and silent submission. He laughed out loud and congratulated me for finally accepting my permanent place at the absolute bottom of the family food chain. He told me I was a weak, pathetic old man who lacked the basic spine to fight for his own property. He tucked the folder firmly under his arm and stepped toward the open doorway. He stopped in the frame and delivered one final aggressive warning. He explicitly ordered me to stay far away from the Grand Hotel venue tomorrow morning. He threatened to have me violently arrested by private security for trespassing if I dared to show my face anywhere near his beautiful bride. Jalen stepped out into the dim hallway and slammed the heavy motel door shut behind him. The cheap wooden frame rattled from the sheer force of his arrogant exit. The metallic deadbolt clicked into place. I stood in the absolute silence of the room and looked down at my own hand. I slowly flexed my fingers. I had deliberately picked up that cheap plastic pen using my left hand. I am strictly right-handed. When I dragged the ink across the designated signature line, I did not sign my actual legal name. I deliberately misspelled my own first and last name in a crude, jagged cursive script that completely failed to match any known government document. The comprehensive non-disclosure agreement Jalen clutched so tightly to his chest was absolutely legally void. It was completely worthless scrap paper. Jalen was too blinded by his own toxic arrogance and desperate relief to verify the physical signature. I turned off the bedside lamp and plunged the room into darkness. That fake signature provided my son with a flawless illusion of absolute security for tomorrow morning. He would walk to the altar believing he was completely invincible right as the federal trap snapped shut. The digital clock on my truck dashboard flipped to exactly 8 o'clock in the morning. The bright morning sun cast long shadows across the empty asphalt of the bank parking lot. It was the morning of the wedding. In exactly 2 hours, Jalen and Megan were scheduled to exchange their vows in a grand ballroom that no longer had a shred of financial backing. I sat deep in the driver's seat with the engine idling quietly. I sipped black coffee from a styrofoam cup and kept my eyes fixed on the heavy glass doors of the financial institution. A sleek silver sports car pulled aggressively into a handicap spot near the front entrance. Arthur stepped out. He wore a sharp navy blue tailored suit with a crisp white shirt and a silk tie perfectly knotted at his collar. He adjusted his expensive cuffs and walked toward the bank entrance with the supreme arrogance of a man who believed he held the entire world in his palm. He pushed through the double doors with aggressive entitlement. He was here to execute his final maneuver. Arthur intended to personally withdraw the remaining escrow funds from the fraudulent sale of my house. He needed the physical cashier checks to pay the remaining kickbacks to his corrupt vendors before the ceremony started. He thought he was walking into a simple administrative transaction to secure his stolen wealth. He had absolutely no idea he was walking directly into a fortified federal trap. I took another slow sip of my coffee. I watched him disappear into the bright lobby. The 48-hour mark had officially passed. The federal investigative wheels were already turning silently in the background. I settled back against the cracked leather seat and waited for the inevitable explosion. My cellular phone vibrated sharply inside my jacket pocket. I pulled it out and checked the caller identification screen. The name Patricia flashed in bright white letters. Patricia was a senior bank teller at this specific branch. 10 years ago, her teenage son suffered a severe spinal injury in a terrible car accident. Her insurance company denied the critical physical therapy claims. Yvonne and I quietly paid those mounting medical bills so Patricia would never have to choose between feeding her family and healing her child. Patricia never forgot that quiet act of solidarity. She remained a fiercely loyal ally inside the cold corporate walls of the bank. I answered the private line immediately. Patricia spoke in a rushed, urgent whisper. She told me I needed to know exactly what was happening inside the lobby right at this very moment. She reported that Arthur was currently standing at the primary manager desk throwing an absolute unhinged temper tantrum. His face was completely flushed and he was pounding his fist aggressively against the polished mahogany counter. The branch manager was attempting to calm him down, but Arthur was only escalating his hostile behavior. Patricia quickly explained the exact cause of his sudden panic. Arthur had demanded an immediate cashier check for the remaining real estate escrow balance. He also tried to push through a final wire transfer to his Cayman Islands shell corporation. The automated banking system flatly denied his demands. Patricia glanced at the internal computer terminal and read the specific error codes to me. The transaction screen flashed a bright red warning banner. The massive offshore wire transfer had triggered an automatic internal security protocol. The bank software flagged the suspicious international routing numbers for immediate fraud review. The entire balance of the stolen $180,000 was officially locked in a rigid pending review status. Arthur could not move a single penny. He was completely locked out of his own fraudulent accounts. Patricia whispered that Arthur was currently threatening to sue the entire bank staff for gross incompetence. He demanded they override the security protocol immediately. He screamed that his daughter was getting married in less than 2 hours and he needed the vendor cash right now. Patricia informed me that the manager refused to bypass the system. The manager legally could not touch the frozen funds. I thanked Patricia for her invaluable loyalty and ended the call. The heavy glass doors of the bank burst open with a violent shove. Arthur stormed out onto the concrete sidewalk. His perfectly combed hair was entirely disheveled. His sharp navy suit jacket flapped open in the wind. His face was a terrifying shade of deep crimson. He furiously stabbed his finger against his smartphone screen while marching rapidly toward his illegally parked silver sports car. He was desperately trying to call his corrupt vendor contacts to beg for a temporary payment extension. I stepped out of my truck and closed the metal door with a solid, definitive thud. I walked directly across the asphalt parking lot to intercept his path. I positioned myself squarely between Arthur and the driver door of his sports car. He stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes widened in sheer disbelief when he recognized my face. He demanded to know what I was doing here and ordered me to get out of his way immediately. I did not move a single inch. I looked him directly in his panic-stricken eyes. I spoke with a calm, slow cadence. I informed Arthur that a sudden pending review status on a massive international wire transfer is never just a simple technical glitch. I explained that banks only lock accounts with that specific security code when they are strictly ordered to do so by a higher federal authority. I told him the pending review was the absolute immediate precursor to a total government asset freeze. I laid out the brutal facts. The federal authorities knew exactly what he did. Arthur dropped his smartphone. The device clattered loudly against the hard pavement. His desperation instantly morphed into violent, blinding rage. He lunged directly at me with his hands outstretched, aimed straight for my throat. I simply shifted my weight backward and pivoted smoothly on the heel of my right boot. Arthur missed my neck completely. His aggressive momentum carried him forward. He stumbled heavily against the hood of his own sports car. He braced his hands against the warm metal and gasped for air. I did not raise my fists. I calmly instructed Arthur to pick up his phone from the asphalt and check his corporate email inbox. Arthur glared at me with pure hatred. He slowly reached down and retrieved the device with shaking fingers. He opened his email application. He stared at the bright screen. All the furious red color instantly drained from his face, leaving a sickly pale white canvas. His jaw went completely slack. The Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division had just served him with an official digital notice of a total asset seizure. Every single corporate account, personal holding, and offshore asset attached to his name was permanently locked under federal mandate. The stolen wedding funds were officially gone. Arthur stared at the screen in absolute terrifying silence. His entire fake empire had just crumbled into dust exactly 90 minutes before his daughter was supposed to walk down the aisle. The dashboard clock on my rusted truck flipped to exactly 9 o'clock in the morning. Only 60 precious minutes remained until the massive bridal march was scheduled to begin. I drove away from the bank parking lot, leaving Arthur entirely paralyzed by his sudden federal ruin. I navigated through the busy downtown traffic and pulled directly onto the immaculate curved brick driveway of the Waldorf Astoria. The towering stone facade screamed of old money and exclusive elite privilege. I bypassed the standard parking garage entrance entirely and steered my battered vehicle straight into the primary VIP drop-off zone. My faded blue paint and cracked chrome bumper stood out violently against the pristine lineup of polished black town cars and leased silver limousines. I shifted the heavy gear column into park and killed the struggling engine. A young valet in a crisp, tailored uniform immediately rushed forward. His face twisted into a mask of pure panic as he frantically waved his white-gloved hands. He aggressively ordered me to move the eyesore immediately before the wealthy wedding guests arrived and complained to upper management about the visual disturbance. I stepped out of the cabin and let the heavy metal door slam shut with a loud, deafening rattle. I reached into my front denim pocket and pulled out a crisp new $50 bill. I did not fold it or try to hand it over discreetly. I held the green currency up high so the bright morning sun illuminated the internal watermark. I stepped forward and pressed the bill directly against the center of his pristine white chest. I looked the young man dead in the eye and instructed him in a calm, even tone to leave my truck parked exactly where it rested. I told him this vehicle was an essential centerpiece for the upcoming theatrical performance. The valet stared down at the cash. He hesitated for only a fraction of a second before quickly sliding the money into his breast pocket. He gave a sharp, compliant nod and practically sprinted away to attend to another arriving vehicle. I stood alone on the pristine brick driveway. I took a deep breath of the cool morning air. I straightened the collar of my worn flannel shirt. The final phase of my quiet adjustments required my direct physical presence. I turned my back on my truck and walked toward the towering glass doors of the luxury hotel. I bypassed the crowded main lobby entirely and navigated through a set of discreet mahogany double doors specifically labeled for hotel administration. The plush, expensive carpeting completely absorbed the heavy thud of my work boots as I walked directly into the executive venue management office. The same sharp event manager from the previous afternoon sat behind his massive desk. He was currently yelling into a telephone headset about delayed floral arrangements and missing crystal centerpieces. He looked up and his eyes widened in sudden, intense alarm as he clearly recognized my calloused hands and faded denim. He quickly slammed the phone down into its cradle. He opened his mouth to shout for the lobby security team to remove the trespassing vagrant. I silenced him instantly by dropping a thick legal envelope directly onto the center of his pristine desk pad. I did not yell or display any dramatic physical aggression. I simply instructed him to open the heavily sealed document immediately. The heavy parchment was officially drafted and fully notarized by Mr. Hayes less than an hour ago. The manager tentatively broke the thick wax seal and pulled out the crisp white pages. He read the stark legal text with rapidly blinking eyes. The formal notice clearly stated that the specific offshore Cayman Islands account tied to the pending wedding autodraft was currently under a massive active federal investigation. The document explicitly detailed severe charges of grand larceny and international wire fraud. It legally warned the hotel administration that attempting to process any scheduled transactions from that specific routing number would constitute the direct receipt of stolen federal funds. The manager swallowed hard. He read the bold warning clause twice to ensure he fully comprehended the severe corporate liability. His hotel was currently hosting a lavish celebration completely funded by laundered criminal capital. Total panic washed over the event manager. His manicured fingers trembled violently as he dropped the legal warning back onto his desk. He lunged forward and desperately began typing his private administrative override passwords into his sleek computer system. He could not afford to wait for the automatic scheduled payment pull at 10 o'clock. He needed to verify the financial security of his establishment right this exact second. He manually initiated the massive $100,000 transaction protocol to force the pending wedding draft to process early. The loading wheel spun on his digital monitor for 10 agonizing seconds. The manager held his breath and stared blindly at the glowing screen. The quiet hum of the office air conditioning was the only sound in the room. Suddenly, a sharp electronic buzz echoed from the computer speakers. The entire monitor instantly flashed a bright, aggressive crimson red. A stark digital banner appeared in bold white lettering. The system clearly read, "Transaction denied, account frozen." The manager gasped aloud and slumped back hard against his ergonomic leather chair. All the color drained completely from his face. His worst nightmare was officially confirmed in harsh digital text. The offshore account was entirely locked and totally inaccessible. The luxury hotel was actively hosting a massive $100,000 wedding party completely blind. They had zero absolute guarantee of receiving a single penny of payment. The crystal chandeliers, the premium catering, the designer floral arrangements, and the bottomless champagne flutes were all currently being consumed on pure, worthless credit. The wealthy socialites dancing in the grand ballroom were violently bleeding the hotel dry by the second. The sheer magnitude of the financial exposure terrified him. He was personally responsible for allowing this massive unsecured debt to accumulate under his direct operational supervision. The manager instantly snapped out of his silent shock and shifted into absolute crisis mode. He grabbed his two-way radio and aggressively barked a series of rapid operational commands. He ordered the banquet captain to immediately halt all premium champagne service across the entire venue. He demanded the executive chef physically lock the doors to the main catering kitchen and cease all culinary preparations until further notice. He then switched radio channels and urgently summoned the primary hotel security detail directly to his office. 4 massive men in dark-fitted suits arrived within 60 seconds. The manager stood up and straightened his tailored tuxedo jacket with ruthless corporate determination. He instructed the heavy security team to follow his exact lead. They were not going to wait for the ceremony to begin. They were going to march directly upstairs to the extravagant bridal suite. The manager intended to confront Megan and her wealthy socialite mother face to face. He was going to demand an immediate alternative form of payment in full before a single guest was allowed to take their seat. The devastating financial reality was finally crashing down onto Megan's fake empire. I remained in the executive office while the manager dispatched his security team. 14 floors above me, Jalen was completely oblivious to his impending destruction. He stood inside the sprawling groom's suite and adjusted the lapels of his custom-tailored velvet tuxedo. He admired his reflection in the full-length gilded mirror. He truly believed he had conquered the world. He felt like an untouchable king preparing to inherit a massive financial empire. 4 of his chosen groomsmen lounged on plush leather sofas around the expansive room. They laughed loudly and poured generous measures of a ridiculously expensive aged whiskey from a crystal decanter. They celebrated their supposed elite status while actively mocking the working-class citizens far below their high-rise window. Jalen checked his reflection one final time and smiled at his own arrogant image. His personal cell phone suddenly vibrated with a sharp, aggressive buzz against the glass surface of the wet bar. He picked up the device and casually glanced at the glowing screen. A digital notification from the hotel room service department flashed across the display. The automated message stated that the primary credit card placed on file for the bridal party had been declined for their exorbitant morning breakfast order. Jalen barely registered the financial warning. He simply rolled his eyes and casually swiped the notification away. He arrogantly assumed it was a minor administrative glitch or a simple bank fraud alert triggered by his massive recent spending spree. He tossed the phone back onto the counter and poured himself another glass of premium whiskey. He raised his crystal tumbler to toast his groomsmen. He fully expected his wealthy future father-in-law to effortlessly resolve any minor accounting errors before the grand ceremony officially commenced. He had absolutely no idea the federal net had already closed tightly around his throat. A heavy, aggressive series of knocks violently rattled the thick oak door of the groom's suite. The loud pounding completely shattered the relaxed, celebratory atmosphere inside the room. Jalen confidently instructed one of his groomsmen to open the door for the hotel staff. He fully expected to see a trailing line of subservient bellhops carrying freshly steamed garments or complimentary bottles of vintage champagne. Instead, the executive event manager marched straight into the private suite. He was closely flanked by 2 massive uniformed security guards. The manager did not offer any traditional hospitality greetings. His face was set in a mask of rigid corporate fury. He held a long printed invoice tightly in his right hand. He walked directly up to Jalen and shoved the piece of paper aggressively toward my son's chest. The manager demanded an immediate alternative form of payment to cover the massive outstanding balance for the entire wedding event. He explicitly stated that the primary offshore routing numbers provided by Arthur had been completely frozen by federal authorities. He delivered a brutal, unyielding ultimatum. Jalen needed to produce $100,000 in verified liquid capital right this exact second, or the hotel would immediately cancel the entire wedding ceremony. The manager promised to order his security team to physically evict the entire bridal party from the premises if the massive debt was not instantly settled. Jalen stared at the manager in absolute bewilderment. He let out a loud, arrogant laugh. He genuinely believed this severe confrontation was nothing more than a ridiculous clerical error. He condescendingly patted the manager on the shoulder and told him to relax his corporate posture. Jalen confidently explained that his future father-in-law possessed massive international wealth and would easily clear up this minor banking misunderstanding within minutes. He treated the manager like an incompetent servant who simply failed to understand high society finance. The manager did not smile or back down from his rigid stance. He firmly repeated his demand for immediate verified payment. Jalen sighed heavily and shook his head in theatrical annoyance. He walked over to his tailored suit jacket and pulled out his expensive designer leather wallet. He wanted to show off his own perceived wealth to his silent groomsmen. He dramatically extracted 3 separate platinum credit cards. He handed the thick metal cards over to the event manager with a smug, triumphant smirk. Jalen proudly declared that any single one of those premium accounts possessed a high enough credit limit to purchase the entire hotel ballroom outright. The event manager did not verbally respond to Jalen's arrogant boasting. He simply produced a sleek wireless payment terminal from his dark suit pocket. He aggressively snatched the first platinum card from Jalen's outstretched hand and swiped the thick metal through the digital reader. The machine processed the data for 3 seconds before emitting a sharp, harsh, negative beep. The digital screen glared with a bright red notification, declined. Jalen frowned and shifted his weight uncomfortably. He quickly insisted that the specific bank must have placed a temporary travel hold on his primary account. He confidently pointed to the second platinum card in the manager's hand. The manager swiped the second card through the machine. The terminal buzzed again with the exact same harsh negative tone. Declined. The arrogant smirk instantly vanished from Jalen's face. A heavy, suffocating silence fell completely over the spacious groom's suite. The four groomsmen slowly lowered their crystal whiskey tumblers to the glass bar. They stared at Jalen with growing, intense suspicion. The manager aggressively swiped the third and final platinum card. The machine screamed its loud digital rejection one final time. Declined. The terminal displayed a direct message instructing the merchant to physically confiscate the fraudulent plastic. Jalen began to sweat profusely inside his heavy velvet tuxedo jacket. His hands trembled violently as he reached for his cell phone. He frantically dialed Arthur's private phone number. He desperately needed his wealthy savior to answer the call and transfer emergency funds to clear his humiliated name. The phone rang endlessly on speakerphone, echoing loudly through the tense, silent room. Arthur did not answer the call. The line abruptly disconnected and went completely dead. Jalen dialed the number a second time with rising sheer panic. The call went straight to a generic automated voicemail system. Arthur was completely gone. Jalen stared blindly at his silent phone screen in a state of absolute total paralysis. His entire carefully constructed reality was violently collapsing around him in real time. The event manager crossed his arms and coldly ordered his security guards to begin physically escorting the groomsmen out of the private suite. Suddenly, a sharp automated text message alert chimed loudly from Jalen's phone. He looked down at the bright display with wide, terrified eyes. The official notification originated directly from the primary fraud division of his personal bank. The stark text delivered the absolute final crushing blow. The message explicitly stated that his entire financial portfolio had been permanently seized by a strict federal mandate. The bank directly cited his active participation in a highly fraudulent real estate transaction involving stolen federal grant property. The heavy cell phone slipped directly through his trembling fingers and crashed violently onto the polished hardwood floor. The screen shattered into dozens of jagged spiderweb cracks. Jalen fell to his knees in his expensive custom tuxedo. The devastating truth finally pierced his thick, arrogant skull. He realized I did not surrender a single thing in that cheap motel room last night. I had actively buried him. The ornate grandfather clock in the hotel lobby chimed exactly 10 times. It was 10 o'clock in the morning. The heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom stood wide open to welcome the elite guests. I walked through the towering threshold and stepped onto the plush crimson carpet. The vast room was absolutely packed with hundreds of wealthy socialites and arrogant corporate executives. A live string quartet played a soft classical piece in the corner of the room. The delicate music floated over the low murmur of high society conversations. I did not wear my faded denim jeans or my scuffed steel-toed work boots. I wore a meticulously tailored dark charcoal suit I had specifically purchased years ago for my own retirement banquet. The wool fabric draped perfectly over my broad shoulders. I paired the suit with a crisp white dress shirt and a solid burgundy tie. I walked directly down the center aisle with absolute, unwavering authority. My heavy footsteps fell in perfect rhythm with the classical cello. The hushed conversations instantly died away as I moved past the rows of white folding chairs. Wealthy guests turned their heads and openly stared at my arrival. Megan and her manipulative parents had spent the last 6 months aggressively spreading vicious rumors about my character. They explicitly told their elite social circle that Jalen was burdened with a pathetic, destitute father who lived entirely in the gutter. They painted me as a helpless, uneducated burden who was entirely unfit to attend such a prestigious gathering. The stark reality of my physical presence instantly shattered their carefully constructed narrative. I held my head high and kept my spine completely rigid. I exuded the quiet, dominant confidence of a man who had spent 40 years building commercial skyscrapers from the ground up. I did not look like a broken victim. I looked like a federal executioner arriving to collect his absolute due. Whispers quickly rippled through the seated crowd. They noticed the sharp contrast between the pathetic lies Megan spread and the dignified reality marching down the aisle. I ignored their piercing stares and focused entirely on the altar at the front of the room. I was not here to seek any form of social validation from a room full of arrogant strangers. I was here to watch my son finally face the brutal consequences of his own toxic greed. I was exactly halfway down the long crimson aisle when a solid figure abruptly stepped out of the front row to block my path. Arthur stood directly in the center of the walkway. His perfectly tailored navy suit jacket was completely unbuttoned and his silk tie hung slightly askew. The utter devastation of the federal asset freeze had visibly aged him 10 years in the last hour. Sweat beaded heavily across his forehead. He glared at me with bloodshot eyes burning with raw, unadulterated hatred. He planted his expensive leather shoes firmly on the carpet and puffed out his chest in a desperate attempt to assert dominance. Arthur hissed through clenched teeth and demanded that I turn around and leave the ballroom immediately. He fiercely ordered me to walk out the front doors and never contact his family again. He tried to project absolute authority, but his voice cracked with underlying terror. He explicitly threatened to have me physically dragged out of the building by his private security contractors if I took one more step toward the altar. He wanted to maintain the illusion of control in front of his wealthy peers. I did not stop walking. I simply adjusted my path and stopped mere inches from his sweating face. I did not argue with his hollow threats or acknowledge his aggressive posture. I looked completely past his shoulder and focused my gaze on the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom. I raised my right hand slightly and executed a subtle, precise gesture. I signaled directly to a pair of specific individuals waiting silently in the outer hallway. Arthur furrowed his brow and quickly snapped his head around to see exactly who I was communicating with. Two tall, imposing men stepped out from the deep shadows of the outer corridor. They walked through the grand double doors and entered the ballroom in perfect unison. They did not wear tuxedos or standard formal attire. They both wore exceptionally sharp, minimalist gray suits. Their posture was rigid and their movements were incredibly calculated. They were senior financial agents dispatched directly from the local Federal Bureau of Investigation field office. They stopped walking the exact moment they crossed the threshold into the room. They stood silently at the back of the center aisle like twin stone gargoyles. They did not approach the seated guests or interrupt the delicate classical music. They simply locked their cold, piercing eyes directly onto Arthur. They watched his every single physical movement with predatory intensity. Arthur stared back at the two federal agents. He immediately recognized the distinct tactical earpieces resting behind their ears and the subtle metallic bulge of the badges clipped to their leather belts. The final remaining shreds of Arthur's aggressive posture instantly crumbled into absolute, unadulterated terror. The wealthy con artist realized that the federal government was not just freezing his digital bank accounts remotely. They had dispatched physical federal agents to visually monitor the primary target of a massive grand larceny investigation. Arthur began to hyperventilate. His shoulders slumped forward and his hands shook violently at his sides. He was a trapped rat standing in a room full of his elite peers. He knew the agents were simply waiting for the exact legal moment to place him in federal handcuffs. He could not run and he could not hide. He was completely surrounded by the disastrous consequences of his own criminal arrogance. I stepped smoothly around Arthur's paralyzed, frozen form. He was entirely incapable of speaking another word. I walked the remaining distance down the crimson carpet and approached the absolute front of the seating arrangement. I selected a premium reserve chair in the very first row. I deliberately took my seat directly across the aisle from Megan's mother. She sat dripping in expensive stolen jewelry and custom imported silk. She immediately noticed my presence. She turned her head and glared at my dark suit with a look of utter absolute disgust. She clearly still believed she was the untouchable queen of a superior financial empire. She had absolutely no idea her husband was currently standing paralyzed in the aisle facing federal prison. I did not break eye contact with her. I simply offered her a cold, tight smile and crossed my legs comfortably. The string quartet suddenly shifted their delicate tempo. The musicians transitioned smoothly into the traditional wedding march. The grand classical music swelled loudly to fill the expansive ballroom. The heavy oak doors at the back of the room swung completely shut. The lavish, fraudulent ceremony was officially about to begin. The security guard outside the boutique lunged forward to grab my shoulder. I simply shifted my weight and let his own momentum carry him stumbling past me onto the concrete. I completely ignored his shouted threats and Megan's piercing demands. I turned my back on their petty sidewalk drama and walked straight past the pristine storefront. I pushed through the heavy brass revolving doors of the adjacent luxury hotel where the extravagant wedding was scheduled to take place. The venue was a towering monument to absolute financial excess. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings painted with intricate classical frescoes. The floors were pristine, polished Italian marble that reflected the golden lighting. I marched across the vast lobby with the heavy, rhythmic thud of my steel-toed work boots echoing sharply against the stone. Wealthy guests in bespoke suits and designer evening wear actively parted to make way for the old man in faded denim and a worn flannel shirt. I walked directly to the primary concierge desk. A sharp man in a fitted tuxedo stood behind the sprawling mahogany counter. A polished gold nameplate identified him as the executive event manager. He looked up from his sleek computer monitor. His perfectly groomed eyebrows immediately pinched together in a display of absolute disdain. He took one single look at my calloused hands and instantly classified me as a trespassing vagrant. He raised a manicured hand and opened his mouth to summon the lobby security detail to forcibly remove me. I did not give him the opportunity to speak a single word of dismissal. I reached into my inner jacket pocket and extracted a thick embossed business card. I slapped it down hard on the polished mahogany surface right over his expensive keyboard. The heavy black cardstock bore the intimidating Silver Eagle logo of the premier federal financial auditing firm in the state. I had consulted for their forensic accounting division for 15 years, verifying municipal construction budgets and exposing corrupt civic contractors. The silver foil lettering carried undeniable federal authority. I leaned my weight forward and rested my heavy knuckles on his pristine desk. I instructed him to look very closely at the credentials. I informed him that I was conducting an active financial review, and any failure to fully cooperate would result in an immediate operational freeze of his entire hospitality establishment. The executive event manager stared down at the Silver Eagle logo. All the arrogant color instantly drained from his face. His manicured hand trembled visibly as he carefully picked up the business card to inspect the embedded federal watermark. He swallowed hard and immediately dropped his condescending elitist attitude. He respectfully addressed me as Sir and frantically typed his high-level administrative password into the hotel computer system. I demanded to see the complete and unfiltered payment ledger for Jalen and Megan's upcoming wedding event. The manager did not hesitate or ask for a formal judicial warrant. He turned his wide, high-resolution monitor around to face me. He quickly brought up the highly detailed billing invoice for the grand ballroom reservation. I scanned the itemized financial data with practiced forensic precision. The glowing screen displayed a massive total balance of $150,000. The payment history showed an initial $50,000 deposit securely applied yesterday morning. I checked the specific transaction routing details. The initial deposit was paid via a direct international wire transfer from the exact offshore shell account Arthur was actively using to hide my stolen retirement funds. I deliberately scrolled down to the pending payment section at the bottom of the invoice. The remaining staggering balance of $100,000 was strictly scheduled to be automatically drafted from that very same offshore account tomorrow morning. I checked the exact digital timestamp for the scheduled transaction. The hotel automated accounting system was rigidly programmed to pull the final massive payment at exactly 10 a.m. That was the precise minute Jalen and Megan were scheduled to stand at the floral altar and formally begin their wedding ceremony. They planned to seamlessly wash the final stolen funds while everyone mindlessly applauded. I instructed the event manager to print a hard copy of the entire billing ledger. I stood at the mahogany desk waiting for the physical documents when a loud, booming laugh echoed across the vast marble lobby. I slowly turned around. Arthur strutted through the main entrance doors. He wore a custom-tailored gray suit and walked with the aggressive, unearned confidence of a man actively spending someone else's fortune. He immediately spotted me standing by the concierge desk. A wide, smug grin spread across his perfectly tanned face. He abruptly changed his path and marched directly toward me. Arthur stopped mere inches from my face and looked me up and down with highly theatrical pity. He loudly mocked me for losing my family home to an eviction crew earlier this morning. He cruelly asked how it felt to be completely outsmarted by a superior intellect. He proudly boasted that his beautiful daughter deserved to be surrounded by high-class wealth and extravagant luxury. He boldly stated she could never survive on the pathetic blue-collar pennies I had desperately scraped together playing in the dirt. Arthur absolutely reveled in his perceived victory. He fully believed he had utterly destroyed my legacy and secured his own permanent financial salvation. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick leather money clip. He deliberately extracted a crisp new $100 bill. He folded the green paper and forcefully shoved it into the front breast pocket of my faded flannel shirt. He patted my chest with a heavy, condescending strike. He told me to go buy myself a hot meal and a one-way bus ticket out of his city. He laughed loudly in my face as a final calculated insult. I did not flinch or react to his physical provocation. I maintained absolute eye contact. I calmly reached 2 fingers into my breast pocket and retrieved the crisp $100 bill. I held the green paper up between our faces. I gripped the edges firmly and ripped the currency perfectly in half. I let the torn pieces flutter down onto the pristine marble floor between his expensive leather shoes. I stepped closer to Arthur and lowered my voice into a cold, dead monotone. I informed him that the United States government takes a very severe stance on international money laundering. I specifically stated that executing a fraudulent real estate transaction and moving the stolen federal funds across state lines constitutes federal wire fraud. I told him that federal wire fraud carries a strict mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years in a maximum security penitentiary. The loud, booming laugh instantly died in Arthur's throat. His smug, triumphant smile vanished completely. The arrogant color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified old man. He stared down at the torn money on the floor. I turned my back on him and walked out of the hotel. Jalen stared down from the elevated altar with absolute horror contorting his perfectly groomed face. The heavy silence in the grand ballroom was entirely suffocating. The wealthy guests turned their collective gaze directly toward me. Jalen suddenly snapped out of his frozen shock and raised a violently shaking finger directly at my chest. He screamed at the top of his lungs. He aggressively ordered me to sit down immediately and stop spreading vicious lies to his elite guests. His voice cracked with a pathetic mixture of rage and sheer panic. He frantically patted down the interior pockets of his custom velvet tuxedo jacket. He withdrew a folded piece of thick legal paper. He uncreased the document with trembling hands and held it high above his head for the entire room to witness. Jalen aggressively announced that the paper in his fist was a legally binding non-disclosure agreement. He shouted that I had willfully signed this exact contract to formalize a generous financial gift. He desperately claimed to the silent crowd that the $180,000 was completely legally surrendered to him to fund his beautiful new life. He paced back and forth across the altar like a cornered animal. He waved the document frantically in the air while insisting that I was simply a bitter old man suffering from severe cognitive decline. He tried to convince the bewildered socialites that I was orchestrating a psychotic public episode because I was jealous of his massive corporate success. Jalen demanded that the event manager immediately call the local authorities to arrest me for criminal trespassing and public defamation. He pointed his shaking finger at me one more time and aggressively swore that he had the absolute legal right to every single penny he withdrew from my accounts. He claimed the contract proved his complete innocence beyond any reasonable doubt. The guests murmured among themselves. Some looked at me with deep suspicion, while others stared at Jalen's frantic, sweating face with clear disgust. Jalen stood at the altar, breathing heavily. He tightly gripped the piece of paper like a physical shield against the crushing reality closing in around him. He genuinely believed that a simple forged document would instantly invalidate my absolute truth and salvage his crumbling wedding day. He stood there demanding vindication from a crowd that was rapidly realizing they were witnessing a spectacular unraveling. I did not sit down or yield a single inch of ground. I stepped out of my row and walked deliberately down the center aisle toward the elevated altar. The heavy thud of my work boots echoed sharply against the marble floor beneath the carpet. I climbed the 3 carpeted steps and invaded his personal space. I stood directly in front of Jalen. I reached into my inner jacket pocket and withdrew a simple silver pen. I calmly instructed my son to lower his voice and look very closely at the ink on the bottom line of his supposed legal shield. Jalen glared at me with absolute hatred but slowly lowered the document. He stared down at the signature line. His furious expression instantly completely dissolved into a mask of pure, utter confusion. The ink did not display my formal legal signature. The script clearly read Mickey Mouse written in crude, jagged, left-handed letters. I had deliberately used my non-dominant hand to ensure the forgery was blatantly obvious to any forensic handwriting expert. Jalen's jaw dropped completely open. He blinked rapidly as his brain struggled to process the juvenile cartoon name staring back at him from the formal legal document. He had been in such a massive rush to secure his stolen funds that he never even bothered to verify the signature on the contract he forced upon me. I took the microphone directly from his trembling hand. I held the document up and read the absurd signature aloud into the booming sound system. The entire grand ballroom instantly erupted. Sharp gasps of shock mingled with loud, stifled laughter from the wealthy guests. The elite socialites openly mocked the arrogant groom who had just presented a cartoon character as his primary legal defense against grand larceny. I dropped the useless piece of paper directly onto the floor at his feet. I reached back into my tailored suit jacket and pulled out a much thicker, heavily embossed folder. I extracted the original notarized deed to my family home. I held the crisp, heavy parchment high above my head for every single person in the massive room to clearly witness. I spoke directly into the microphone with a cold, unwavering cadence. I detailed exactly how my own biological son had meticulously planned to strip me of everything I owned. I explained that while I was heavily medicated and actively undergoing grueling physical therapy for a severe spinal injury, Jalen had sneaked into my private study. He had deliberately forged my signature on a massive real estate transfer protocol. I laid out the brutal, indisputable facts to the silent crowd. Jalen had illegally sold the house I built with my own 2 hands to a corrupt corporate developer for pennies on the dollar. I exposed the exact numeric figure without hesitation. I announced that Jalen had systematically drained exactly $180,000 directly from my private retirement fund to finance this lavish, fraudulent wedding. The laughter completely died in the ballroom. The guests stared at Jalen in absolute sheer horror. The sheer magnitude of his calculated betrayal disgusted the entire crowd. I looked my son dead in the eye and stated that he did not build an empire. I told him he built a pathetic, fragile house of cards completely entirely financed by the literal blood and sweat of his own father. Jalen shrank back against the floral archway. He had absolutely no defense left. His entire fake persona was completely entirely dismantled in front of the exact people he desperately wanted to impress today. A sudden sharp gasp from the back of the ballroom shattered the heavy silence. Every head in the room instantly turned toward the grand double doors. Megan stood entirely frozen under the massive crystal archway. She wore an incredibly lavish designer wedding gown heavily adorned with imported lace and sparkling diamonds. Her pristine bridal veil was pushed back over her shoulders. She had been standing in the outer corridor waiting for her grand musical cue. She had clearly heard every single word of my booming public execution. Jalen immediately lunged forward and reached out his hands toward his beautiful bride. He desperately shouted her name and begged her to let him explain the massive misunderstanding. He swore that everything was going to be fine. Megan did not run toward the altar to comfort her ruined groom. She did not even look at Jalen. She slowly turned her head and locked her furious, burning eyes directly onto her own father. Arthur was still standing completely paralyzed in the center aisle, flanked heavily by the 2 silent federal agents. Megan stared at him with raw, absolute, unadulterated disgust. The devastating reality finally connected in her mind. Her father had knowingly orchestrated this entire massive criminal fraud. Megan did not hesitate for a single second. She marched aggressively down the center aisle of the grand ballroom. Her lavish designer wedding gown dragged heavily across the crimson carpet. The delicate imported lace caught on the edges of the folding chairs, but she simply ripped the fabric free with a violent jerk of her waist. She walked directly past the elevated altar. She completely ignored Jalen. She did not even cast a fleeting glance at the man she was supposed to vow her life to within the hour. Her burning eyes remained locked entirely on her father. Arthur shrank back against the presence of the 2 silent federal agents. Megan stopped mere inches from his sweating face. She did not lower her voice or attempt to maintain any shred of high society decorum. She screamed at the top of her lungs. She demanded to know exactly where the offshore kickback money was currently hiding. She furiously stated that she had held up her end of the miserable bargain. She played the role of the blushing bride and dragged this pathetic charade all the way to the altar. She aggressively demanded her guaranteed payout. The ballroom echoed with her shrill, piercing voice. Megan openly revealed the entire toxic arrangement to the horrified crowd. She loudly declared that she never harbored a single ounce of affection for Jalen. She stated that he was nothing more than a convenient, gullible mark. She explicitly confessed that she only agreed to marry him because Arthur had promised her a massive 50% cut of the stolen real estate funds. She desperately needed that specific influx of laundered cash to immediately pay off her own mountain of secret, crippling credit card debts. She detailed how she owed hundreds of thousands of dollars to ruthless private lenders to fund her fake, luxurious lifestyle. She had actively conspired with her father to bleed my son dry. She pushed her finger hard into Arthur's chest and demanded the escrow transfer numbers right this exact second. She refused to let him drag her down into federal ruin. She screamed that she would happily testify against him in open court if he did not produce her promised wealth instantly. The sheer viciousness of her betrayal hung heavily in the dead silence of the room. The immaculate illusion of the perfect blushing bride evaporated completely into the cold air. Jalen stood absolutely frozen on the elevated altar. The silver pen slipped from his numb fingers and clattered loudly against the polished marble floor. His perfectly groomed face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated devastation. The grand illusion of his fairy tale romance shattered instantly into a million jagged pieces. Every single kiss, every shared secret, every whispered promise of a beautiful future was completely exposed as a calculated transactional lie. Megan had never loved him for a single second. She was an active, vicious co-conspirator in a massive financial scheme designed to entirely destroy his life. She viewed him as a pathetic stepping stone to clear her own toxic financial ruin. Jalen stumbled down the carpeted steps toward the center aisle. He looked like a wounded animal desperately seeking any form of comfort or rational explanation. He reached his shaking hand out and gently attempted to touch Megan on the shoulder. He softly whispered her name in a pathetic, broken plea. Megan spun around with lightning speed. She raised her hand and violently slapped his fingers away from her pristine white dress. The sharp crack of skin striking skin echoed violently through the silent ballroom. She recoiled from his physical touch with brutal, overwhelming disgust. She looked him dead in the eye and venomously ordered him never to touch her again. She coldly informed Jalen that he was nothing but a broke, pathetic loser who had just lost his entire stolen empire. She laughed mockingly at his custom velvet tuxedo and told him he was utterly worthless without his stolen bank accounts. She systematically dismantled his entire fragile ego with ruthless surgical precision right in front of hundreds of silent, staring guests. He had sacrificed his own father for a woman who viewed him as utter garbage. The heavy, suffocating silence inside the grand ballroom suddenly fractured into a wave of absolute chaotic outrage. The hundreds of wealthy elite guests began to stand up from their white folding chairs. Low mutters of shock rapidly escalated into loud, aggressive shouts of sheer disgust. The elite socialites who had spent the entire morning drinking premium champagne and celebrating their superior status now realized they were attending a fully funded criminal fraud. They were actively participating in a federal crime scene. Megan's mother sat frozen in the front row as the brutal truth of her family's absolute financial ruin washed over her. She watched her daughter viciously turn against her husband in front of their entire social circle. The sheer weight of the catastrophic public humiliation finally broke her carefully maintained posture. She let out a loud theatrical shriek and dramatically fainted sideways directly across the laps of the horrified guests seated next to her. Nobody rushed forward to offer her medical assistance. They actively recoiled from her slumped body, as if she carried a highly contagious disease. The pristine image of the perfect elite white family was permanently obliterated. They were completely exposed to the world as a pathetic syndicate of broke, desperate con artists. They possessed no actual wealth, no legacy, and no loyalty. They were currently actively turning on each other like a pack of starved wolves fighting over a completely barren carcass. The beautiful floral arrangements and classical music felt violently absurd against the raw display of absolute toxic greed. The guests began pushing their way toward the side exits. They desperately wanted to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of the fraudulent ceremony. The grand wedding had completely devolved into a spectacular, brutal theater of absolute destruction. Arthur panicked as the entire room descended into total chaotic revolt. His meticulously crafted illusion of supreme authority was entirely dead. He lunged forward and aggressively grabbed Megan by the lace sleeve of her expensive wedding gown. He completely ignored her loud, violent protests and began physically dragging her toward the nearest discreet side door. He desperately intended to escape the ballroom and flee the luxury hotel before the federal authorities could fully secure the active crime scene. He blindly dragged his struggling daughter through the maze of abandoned white folding chairs. He pushed aggressively past the fleeing wealthy guests. He reached out his sweating hand to grasp the brass handle of the heavy wooden side door. He never made contact with the polished metal. The two tall men in sharp, minimalist gray suits moved with terrifying, synchronized speed. The federal financial agents stepped smoothly out of the shadows and physically blocked the entire exit path. They stood shoulder to shoulder, forming an impenetrable human wall of absolute federal authority. They did not draw their weapons or raise their voices. They simply stared down at the sweating, broken con artist. The fortified steel trap had officially snapped completely shut. The taller of the two gray-suited men reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored jacket. He produced a sleek leather wallet and flipped it open with a sharp flick of his wrist. A heavy gold badge caught the bright light of the crystal chandeliers. He spoke with a booming, authoritative voice that completely silenced the remaining frantic whispers in the grand ballroom. He announced himself as Special Agent Vance of the Federal Bureau of Investigation Financial Crimes Division. He stated clearly that absolutely nobody was permitted to leave the room until the immediate area was fully secured. He signaled to a squad of uniformed officers waiting silently in the lobby. They moved swiftly to secure every single exit point in the massive venue, physically blocking the heavy brass doors. The agent looked directly at Arthur and listed the exact federal charges with brutal precision. He declared that Arthur and his immediate associates were officially under arrest for international wire fraud conspiracy to commit fraud and the direct forgery of federal real estate documents. The agent explained that moving stolen funds across state lines and funneling them through offshore Cayman Island shell accounts triggered an automatic federal mandate. The sheer weight of the charges hung over the frozen crowd. Arthur stared at the gold badge as if it were a loaded weapon aimed directly at his chest. The elite guests, who had not managed to flee, stood completely paralyzed in their designer gowns and expensive tuxedos. They were suddenly unwilling witnesses to a massive federal takedown. The agent coldly detailed how the entire $180,000 transfer had been meticulously tracked from the moment Jalen illegally signed the fraudulent deed. He explained that the federal net had been quietly tightening around Arthur's fake corporate empire for the last 48 hours. The trap was perfectly executed. Arthur's initial paralyzing terror rapidly mutated into the desperate, aggressive defense of a cornered predator. He aggressively pushed his daughter behind him and puffed out his chest. He loudly insisted that he was a legitimate businessman who had legally purchased the property through an independent licensed real estate agent. He swore blindly that he had absolutely no knowledge of any forged signatures or stolen retirement funds. He pointed a shaking finger at me and desperately accused me of fabricating the entire criminal narrative out of pure, bitter jealousy. He confidently demanded that the federal agents produce one single shred of concrete evidence connecting him to any intentional fraud or money laundering. Special Agent Vance did not argue with the sweating con artist. He did not raise his voice or match Arthur's frantic energy. He simply reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek, digital smartphone. He tapped the screen twice and held the device up for the entire silent ballroom to witness. A crystal-clear audio recording began to play loudly through the phone speaker. It was Megan's sharp, entitled voice echoing clearly from the bridal boutique just a few days ago. The audio captured her explicitly instructing her father to urgently launder the stolen real estate money through his offshore shell companies. The recording featured her exact cruel words demanding he wash the funds quickly to pay for her extravagant designer wedding dress and cover her massive secret credit card debts. The wealthy socialites in the front rows gasped audibly, entirely scandalized by the raw criminal greed laid bare in the recording. They actively whispered among themselves, exchanging horrified glances as the absolute vulgarity of the scheme was broadcasted over the venue speakers. I sat comfortably in the front row and allowed a slow, cold smile to spread across my face. The microscopic audio transmitter I had securely planted inside Megan's oversized designer purse during our brief physical collision outside the boutique had performed its job flawlessly. It had captured every single damning syllable of their criminal conspiracy in high-definition audio. Arthur's jaw dropped completely slack. The undeniable sound of his own daughter orchestrating a federal financial crime echoed off the vaulted marble ceiling. The audio clip conclusively proved premeditated intent and active participation in international money laundering. Arthur's desperate lies were instantly incinerated by the absolute undeniable truth. His fake legitimate businessman persona was entirely destroyed. He had absolutely nowhere left to hide. Jalen stared blankly at the federal agent. The booming audio recording of Megan's voice completely shattered his final remaining illusion. His legs simply gave out beneath his heavy velvet tuxedo. He dropped heavily to his knees right in the center of the plush crimson aisle. The devastating reality of his arrogant actions finally crashed down upon his shoulders with crushing absolute weight. He had not outsmarted his blue-collar father. He had not secured a brilliant financial future. He had blindly, eagerly walked directly into a massive federal prison sentence. He looked up at the towering federal agents with wide, terrified eyes. Tears of genuine panic began to stream down his pale face. He frantically reached out his trembling hands and begged the agents to believe him. He babbled uncontrollably, claiming he had absolutely zero knowledge of the Cayman Islands Shell Corporation or the international money laundering scheme. He desperately tried to throw Arthur and Megan under the bus to save his own skin. He swore he thought it was a simple real estate transfer and blamed his new bride for manipulating the stolen funds. He sobbed loudly on the marble floor, entirely stripped of his arrogant elite persona. He was no longer the untouchable king of a high society empire. He was just a pathetic, terrified criminal begging for mercy in front of the father he had so callously betrayed. His groomsmen actively backed away from his kneeling form, treating him like a complete pariah. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with a man facing decades behind bars. Jalen finally realized that his toxic greed had permanently destroyed his entire existence. He buried his face in his hands and wailed loudly as the heavy consequences of his forgery locked him into an inescapable nightmare. Special Agent Vance completely ignored Jalen's pathetic sobbing. He did not even cast a fleeting glance down at the kneeling groom. The agent stepped forward with practiced tactical precision and focused his cold, authoritative gaze entirely on the bride. He loudly and clearly read Megan her formal Miranda rights. He listed her right to remain silent and her right to a federal attorney as he smoothly unclipped a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his leather belt. Megan let out a piercing, horrified scream. She thrashed wildly in her lavish imported lace wedding gown. She aggressively tried to claw her way backward away from the advancing federal officer. The heavy layers of designer fabric tangled around her legs and caused her to stumble awkwardly against the wooden folding chairs. The second federal agent stepped in and efficiently secured her flailing arms behind her back. The cold steel cuffs clicked sharply around her delicate wrists, locking with a loud, definitive snap. Her furious screams echoed through the grand ballroom as the grand illusion of her perfect elite life ended in absolute, utter ruin. She was no longer a wealthy socialite preparing to say her vows, but a federal inmate violently resisting arrest in front of her entire horrified family. The grand ballroom completely surrendered to absolute bedlam. The meticulously curated illusion of high society elegance violently shattered the moment the cold steel handcuffs clicked around Megan's wrists. Hundreds of wealthy elite guests erupted into a synchronized stampede of pure panic. They aggressively shoved each other aside in a desperate, frantic rush toward the main exit doors. Crystal champagne flutes shattered against the polished marble floor, sending sharp shards of glass flying across the crimson carpet. Lavish gift boxes wrapped in silver ribbons were carelessly trampled under the expensive leather heels of fleeing socialites. Nobody wanted to be caught standing anywhere near an active federal crime scene. The soft classical music had entirely ceased, leaving only the chaotic echoes of screaming guests and barking federal orders. Arthur refused to accept his immediate reality. He violently shoved his right shoulder against the taller federal agent in a pathetic, desperate attempt to break the secure perimeter line. He aggressively thrashed his arms and screamed at the top of his lungs. He loudly threatened to summon a massive battalion of high-powered corporate lawyers to utterly destroy the agent's professional careers. He spat venomous insults and swore he possessed absolute judicial immunity from these ridiculous fabricated charges. The federal agents did not tolerate his physical resistance for a single second. The taller agent smoothly pivoted his tactical stance and swept Arthur's expensive leather shoes completely out from under his center of gravity. The agent aggressively drove Arthur face first directly into the heavily decorated plaster wall. The loud, hollow thud of the violent impact silenced his arrogant threats instantly. The second agent forcefully wrenched Arthur's arms behind his back with practiced, ruthless precision. The heavy steel handcuffs ratcheted tightly around his wrists, locking his inevitable fate into place. Arthur's immaculate, custom-tailored gray suit was violently wrinkled and covered in fine white plaster dust. His perfectly combed hair hung in sweaty, disheveled clumps across his flushed forehead. His elite, untouchable facade was entirely obliterated in a matter of seconds. He did not look like a masterful corporate titan or a brilliant strategic mastermind. He looked exactly like a pathetic, desperate criminal completely consumed by the raw, suffocating panic of a man who had just lost his entire stolen empire. He slumped heavily against the wall and began to weep loudly as the agents formally read him his federal rights. Jalen remained completely frozen on his knees in the exact center of the plush crimson aisle. He did not move to help his screaming bride or his weeping father-in-law. The chaotic stampede of fleeing guests surged wildly around him, but he stayed anchored to the floor in a state of catatonic shock. A third federal agent detached himself from the secure perimeter group and walked slowly down the aisle toward the altar. The agent unclipped a fresh pair of steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. The metallic clinking sound finally broke through Jalen's paralyzed trance. He looked up and watched the federal officer closing the distance with absolute, unwavering purpose. Jalen scrambled backward on his hands and knees. The plush velvet fabric of his custom tuxedo bunched awkwardly around his trembling legs. He desperately turned his head away from the advancing agent and locked his wide, terrified eyes directly onto my face. The sheer arrogant confidence that had defined his entire adult life was completely gone. He looked exactly like the terrified 10-year-old boy who used to break the neighbor's windows and beg me to shield him from the consequences. Tears streamed heavily down his pale, sweating cheeks. He reached out a violently shaking hand toward where I stood. He cried out my name with a pathetic, broken wail. He frantically begged me to tell the federal agents to stop their advance. He desperately pleaded with me to use my influence to fix this massive, catastrophic disaster. He loudly reminded me of all the times I had quietly bailed him out of financial trouble in his reckless youth. He begged me to protect him from the federal authorities and promised he would immediately return every single stolen penny to my bank accounts. I did not flinch or look away from his pathetic, groveling form. I took 2 slow, deliberate steps forward and closed the physical distance between us. I stood tall and looked down at the biological son I had sacrificed my entire adult life to protect. I looked at the man who had gladly drained my retirement accounts and actively conspired to leave me destitute on the streets. I felt absolutely zero remaining traces of paternal obligation. The unconditional love I had blindly freely given him for decades had been entirely burned away by his own toxic, calculated greed. I spoke in a low, cold, and completely unwavering voice that easily cut through his frantic sobbing. I informed Jalen that my days of quietly absorbing the brutal consequences of his selfish actions were permanently over. I told him that I had spent 40 years breaking my back in the dirt to provide him with a pristine, honorable foundation. He chose to take that solid foundation and build a fraudulent criminal empire out of pure, arrogant entitlement. I looked deep into his terrified, tear-filled eyes and delivered the final, absolute truth. I stated clearly that a real father will always stand up to protect a son from genuine, honest mistakes. I paused and let the heavy reality of the moment settle over his trembling shoulders. Then I told him that a father absolutely does not protect a convicted criminal from facing rightful federal justice. I crossed my arms over my chest and took one distinct, definitive step backward. I physically and emotionally severed the final remaining thread of our toxic relationship. I surrendered him completely to the uncompromising authority of the federal agents waiting directly behind him. The federal agent did not offer Jalen another second to plead his worthless case. He stepped forward and grabbed Jalen firmly by the expensive velvet lapels of his custom tuxedo. He violently hauled my weeping son up from the carpeted floor and forced him aggressively onto his feet. The agent swiftly twisted Jalen's trembling arms behind his back. The cold, heavy steel handcuffs snapped shut around his wrists with a loud, sharp finality. Jalen's head dropped heavily forward in absolute, utter defeat as the agent roughly pushed him forward. He was forcefully marched directly down the exact center of the plush crimson aisle. This was the precise, immaculate path he had proudly intended to walk as a triumphant, untouchable groom just a few minutes ago. He was now leaving the grand ballroom as a completely disgraced and humiliated felon. The remaining hotel security staff stood in absolute stunned silence as the 3 exposed con artists were paraded through the heavy oak double doors. The massive crystal chandeliers cast long, mocking shadows over their departing shackled figures. The meticulous federal trap had functioned perfectly. The toxic financial illusion was permanently dead, and the absolute brutal reality of federal justice had finally arrived. The grand ballroom completely surrendered to absolute bedlam. The meticulously curated illusion of high society elegance violently shattered the moment the cold steel handcuffs clicked around Megan's wrists. Hundreds of wealthy, elite guests erupted into a synchronized stampede of pure panic. They aggressively shoved each other aside in a desperate, frantic rush toward the main exit doors. Crystal champagne flutes shattered against the polished marble floor, sending sharp shards of glass flying across the crimson carpet. Lavish gift boxes wrapped in silver ribbons were carelessly trampled under the expensive leather heels of fleeing socialites. Nobody wanted to be caught standing anywhere near an active federal crime scene. The soft classical music had entirely ceased, leaving only the chaotic echoes of screaming guests and barking federal orders. Arthur refused to accept his immediate reality. He violently shoved his right shoulder against the taller federal agent in a pathetic, desperate attempt to break the secure perimeter line. He aggressively thrashed his arms and screamed at the top of his lungs. He loudly threatened to summon a massive battalion of high-powered corporate lawyers to utterly destroy the agent's professional careers. He spat venomous insults and swore he possessed absolute judicial immunity from these ridiculous fabricated charges. The federal agents did not tolerate his physical resistance for a single second. The taller agent smoothly pivoted his tactical stance and swept Arthur's expensive leather shoes completely out from under his center of gravity. The agent aggressively drove Arthur face first directly into the heavily decorated plaster wall. The loud, hollow thud of the violent impact silenced his arrogant threats instantly. The second agent forcefully wrenched Arthur's arms behind his back with practiced, ruthless precision. The heavy steel handcuffs ratcheted tightly around his wrists, locking his inevitable fate into place. Arthur's immaculate custom-tailored gray suit was violently wrinkled and covered in fine, white plaster dust. His perfectly combed hair hung in sweaty, disheveled clumps across his flushed forehead. His elite, untouchable facade was entirely obliterated in a matter of seconds. He did not look like a masterful corporate titan or a brilliant strategic mastermind. He looked exactly like a pathetic, desperate criminal completely consumed by the raw, suffocating panic of a man who had just lost his entire stolen empire. He slumped heavily against the wall and began to weep loudly as the agents formally read him his federal rights. Jalen remained completely frozen on his knees in the exact center of the plush crimson aisle. He did not move to help his screaming bride or his weeping father-in-law. The chaotic stampede of fleeing guests surged wildly around him, but he stayed anchored to the floor in a state of catatonic shock. A third federal agent detached himself from the secure perimeter group and walked slowly down the aisle toward the altar. The agent unclipped a fresh pair of steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. The metallic clinking sound finally broke through Jalen's paralyzed trance. He looked up and watched the federal officer closing the distance with absolute, unwavering purpose. Jalen scrambled backward on his hands and knees. The plush velvet fabric of his custom tuxedo bunched awkwardly around his trembling legs. He desperately turned his head away from the advancing agent and locked his wide, terrified eyes directly onto my face. The sheer arrogant confidence that had defined his entire adult life was completely gone. He looked exactly like the terrified 10-year-old boy who used to break the neighbor's windows and beg me to shield him from the consequences. Tears streamed heavily down his pale, sweating cheeks. He reached out a violently shaking hand toward where I stood. He cried out my name with a pathetic, broken wail. He frantically begged me to tell the federal agents to stop their advance. He desperately pleaded with me to use my influence to fix this massive, catastrophic disaster. He loudly reminded me of all the times I had quietly bailed him out of financial trouble in his reckless youth. He begged me to protect him from the federal authorities and promised he would immediately return every single stolen penny to my bank accounts. I did not flinch or look away from his pathetic, groveling form. I took 2 slow, deliberate steps forward and closed the physical distance between us. I stood tall and looked down at the biological son I had sacrificed my entire adult life to protect. I looked at the man who had gladly drained my retirement accounts and actively conspired to leave me destitute on the streets. I felt absolutely zero remaining traces of paternal obligation. The unconditional love I had blindly freely given him for decades had been entirely burned away by his own toxic, calculated greed. I spoke in a low, cold, and completely unwavering voice that easily cut through his frantic sobbing. I informed Jalen that my days of quietly absorbing the brutal consequences of his selfish actions were permanently over. I told him that I had spent 40 years breaking my back in the dirt to provide him with a pristine, honorable foundation. He chose to take that solid foundation and build a fraudulent criminal empire out of pure, arrogant entitlement. I looked deep into his terrified, tear-filled eyes and delivered the final absolute truth. I stated clearly that a real father will always stand up to protect a son from genuine, honest mistakes. I paused and let the heavy reality of the moment settle over his trembling shoulders. Then I told him that a father absolutely does not protect a convicted criminal from facing rightful federal justice. I crossed my arms over my chest and took one distinct, definitive step backward. I physically and emotionally severed the final remaining thread of our toxic relationship. I surrendered him completely to the uncompromising authority of the federal agents waiting directly behind him. The federal agent did not offer Jalen another second to plead his worthless case. He stepped forward and grabbed Jalen firmly by the expensive velvet lapels of his custom tuxedo. He violently hauled my weeping son up from the carpeted floor and forced him aggressively onto his feet. The agent swiftly twisted Jalen's trembling arms behind his back. The cold, heavy steel handcuffs snapped shut around his wrists with a loud, sharp finality. Jalen's head dropped heavily forward in absolute, utter defeat as the agent roughly pushed him forward. He was forcefully marched directly down the exact center of the plush crimson aisle. This was the precise, immaculate path he had proudly intended to walk as a triumphant, untouchable groom just a few minutes ago. He was now leaving the grand ballroom as a completely disgraced and humiliated felon. The remaining hotel security staff stood in absolute stunned silence as the three exposed con artists were paraded through the heavy oak double doors. The massive crystal chandeliers cast long, mocking shadows over their departing, shackled figures. The meticulous federal trap had functioned perfectly. The toxic financial illusion was permanently dead, and the absolute brutal reality of federal justice had finally arrived. 2 days later, the chaotic echoes of the shattered wedding had been replaced by the oppressive, sterile silence of the federal detention center. I sat rigidly in a cold, metallic visitation room. The harsh fluorescent lighting cast pale, unforgiving shadows across the heavy, reinforced glass divider separating the free world from the incarcerated. The heavy steel door on the opposite side of the small booth buzzed and clicked open. A burly armed guard escorted my biological son into the confined space. Jalen was completely stripped of his custom velvet tuxedo and his expensive imported watch. He wore an oversized, stiff orange prison jumpsuit that hung awkwardly on his frame. His perfectly groomed hair was now a greasy, disheveled tangle sticking to his sweating forehead. The arrogant, untouchable high society groom I had confronted at the altar was entirely gone. In his place sat a small, terrified, and utterly desperate inmate facing the absolute destruction of his life. The crushing reality of federal confinement had physically diminished him overnight. He looked pale, exhausted, and consumed by raw panic. He sank heavily into the bolted metal chair opposite me. He stared at me with wide, bloodshot eyes before reaching out with violently trembling hands to pick up the heavy black telephone receiver. I slowly lifted my own receiver and pressed it against my ear, waiting in absolute silence for the man who had stolen my future to speak his first words from behind bars. The second the line connected, Jalen completely broke down into heavy, pathetic sobs. His voice cracked and pitched wildly as he frantically begged me to call the federal prosecutors and drop the criminal charges. He pleaded with me to refuse a subpoena and refuse to testify against him in open federal court. He desperately swore that he would personally pay back every single cent he had stolen from my retirement accounts. He aggressively promised to work 3 exhausting minimum wage jobs the moment he was released to restore my financial security. He babbled uncontrollably, promising to finally transform into the dutiful, respectful, and loyal son I had always wanted him to be. When his pathetic promises failed to elicit a single reaction from my stoic expression, his tone shifted. He seamlessly pivoted to playing the ultimate innocent victim. He bitterly and loudly blamed Megan and Arthur for the entire catastrophic situation. He claimed those 2 elite monsters had preyed upon his vulnerable ambition and manipulated him into a corner. He insisted that Arthur had practically forced him to sign the forged real estate documents under immense psychological pressure and the threat of canceling the wedding. Jalen cried into the receiver, insisting he was just a naive, trusting pawn in their massive international money laundering syndicate. He swore he never intended to leave me homeless and destitute. He desperately tried to convince me that the fraudulent shell companies and the Cayman Islands accounts were entirely Arthur's grand design, and he was simply following the instructions of his future father-in-law to secure a better life. He begged me to see him as a victim of a wealthy family's manipulation rather than the architect of my financial ruin. I sat perfectly still on my side of the booth and listened to his calculated, desperate monologue. I felt absolutely zero sympathy for the weeping man on the other side of the thick, reinforced glass. I did not shed a single tear for the son who had gladly sold my life's work to finance his own illusion of grandeur. I raised my right hand and tapped my heavy knuckles firmly against the thick glass divider, instantly silencing his pathetic rambling. I spoke into the black receiver with a low, unwavering, and incredibly cold voice. I reminded my son of the absolute indisputable facts. I stated clearly that Arthur did not hold a loaded weapon to his head when he sneaked into my private study. Megan did not physically force his hand to meticulously forge my signature on the federal deed while I was heavily medicated in physical therapy. Nobody compelled him to systematically drain my life savings to fund a lavish, fraudulent luxury lifestyle. Jalen made a conscious, deliberate, and entirely selfish choice. He willingly chose toxic greed and elite status over his own flesh and blood. I looked him dead in his terrified eyes and dismantled his final remaining hope. I declared with absolute finality that I would stand before a federal judge and testify fully accurately and without a single ounce of hesitation about every single crime he committed. A father's duty is to protect a son from honest mistakes, but a father does not protect a convicted criminal from facing rightful earned justice. Jalen's pathetic weeping facade instantly evaporated into thin air. The crushing realization that I would not save him completely shattered his manipulative victim act. His pale face twisted violently into a mask of ugly, venomous rage. He screamed furiously into the plastic receiver, spewing vile curses and completely exposing his true, unrepentant nature. He dropped the black phone and began violently banging his clenched fists against the reinforced glass divider in a massive, uncontrolled tantrum. His muffled screams echoed uselessly inside the secure booth. I did not react to his aggressive physical outburst. I calmly placed my black receiver back onto its metal cradle, cutting off the audio completely. I stood up slowly from the cold steel chair and straightened my jacket. I turned my back on the screaming felon trapped inside the federal cage. I walked directly toward the heavy exit door and stepped out of the prison facility, walking into the bright sunlight without casting a single glance backward. I drove my heavy steel work truck down the familiar suburban street and pulled into my own concrete driveway. The aggressive neon yellow eviction notice that had been taped across my front door just a few days ago was completely gone. I pulled my brass key from my pocket and slid it into the familiar lock. The heavy deadbolt clicked open with a satisfying and permanent snap. I stepped across the threshold and closed the solid oak door firmly behind me. The house was entirely quiet. The frantic, desperate energy that Jalen had recently brought into this space was completely erased. The afternoon sunlight filtered softly through the living room blinds and illuminated the microscopic dust motes dancing in the still air. I walked slowly through the main hallway and ran my calloused hand along the smooth wooden banister. This was the exact house I had maintained with my own two hands, and the absolute sanctuary where Yvonne and I had shared our greatest joys. Every single room was deeply saturated with her enduring memory. The faded floral curtains she had meticulously sewn still hung perfectly in the dining room windows. The small scratches on the hardwood floorboards marked the exact spot where we used to push the heavy oak dining table aside to dance on our anniversary. Her calming presence was woven directly into the physical foundation of the structure. I walked into the kitchen and stood in the center of the linoleum floor. I did not feel like a victim or a discarded old man. I felt like a man who had successfully defended his rightful castle against a ruthless and calculated siege. I reached into the wooden cabinets and pulled out the old glass coffee pot. I measured out the dark roasted grounds and started brewing a fresh pot of strong black coffee. The rich, bitter aroma quickly filled the kitchen and overpowered the lingering sterile scent of the eviction crew's brief invasion. I poured the steaming dark liquid into my favorite ceramic mug and took a long, slow sip. The intense heat rushed down my throat and grounded me completely in the present moment. I walked back into the living room and sat down heavily in my worn leather recliner. I planted my steel-toed work boots firmly on the rug and reclaimed my absolute sovereign territory. Nobody would ever threaten my home again. A sharp knock at the front door interrupted the quiet afternoon. I placed my ceramic mug on the side table and walked over to open the door. Mr. Hayes stood on my front porch holding a thick leather briefcase. He wore a sharp navy suit and a genuinely triumphant smile. He stepped into the hallway and followed me directly into the kitchen. He placed his heavy briefcase on the kitchen island and snapped the brass latches open. He extracted a pristine stack of formal banking documents and laid them out flat on the counter. He announced with absolute certainty that the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Banking Authority had officially entirely reversed the fraudulent real estate transaction. The illegal offshore wire transfer had been completely intercepted and nullified. He handed me the finalized stamped paperwork proving that the deed to the house was fully unequivocally back in my name. The Cayman Islands shell company created by Arthur and Jalen was completely dismantled by federal regulators. Mr. Hayes then turned to the second stack of documents. He confirmed that the bank had successfully seized the remaining wedding funds directly from Arthur's frozen corporate accounts. My entire stolen retirement fund of $180,000 was fully restored to the exact penny. He then slid a final heavily embossed check across the smooth counter. He explained that the title insurance company had formally admitted gross negligence in approving a blatantly forged property deed. They had issued a massive financial settlement to entirely avoid a brutal federal lawsuit. I stared down at the staggering numeric figure printed on the heavy paper. I was actually significantly wealthier now than I was before Jalen attempted his massive financial betrayal. The calculated theft had ironically secured my absolute permanent financial independence. Mr. Hayes carefully organized the remaining legal documents and slid them back into his leather briefcase. He leaned against the kitchen island and looked at me with a calm, professional curiosity. He asked me exactly what I planned to do with my newly restored and significantly expanded financial portfolio. I took another slow sip of my black coffee and looked out the kitchen window toward the sprawling backyard. I told him my first immediate order of business was to completely restructure my estate. I instructed Mr. Hayes to draft a brand new ironclad legal trust effectively immediately. I explicitly ordered him to entirely remove Jalen from my last will and testament. I erased my biological son from every single legal document and financial beneficiary form I possessed. He would not receive a single dime from my estate upon my death. He had actively chosen toxic greed and unearned elite status over genuine family loyalty. He had deliberately tried to leave me dying on the streets to fund his pathetic illusion of high society grandeur. Therefore, I was completely severing his access to my legacy. Mr. Hayes nodded in absolute professional agreement and noted the swift changes on his legal pad. He asked if I intended to leave the funds to any extended family members or distant relatives. I shook my head and stated firmly that no family member would inherit this money. The toxic cycle of generational greed and absolute financial entitlement ended with me today. I refused to let my hard-earned wealth corrupt another relative or transform into a twisted weapon. The money needed to serve an entirely different purpose. I instructed the lawyer to prepare the foundational paperwork to establish a completely independent charitable entity. I reached into the back pocket of my faded denim jeans and pulled out a folded, glossy brochure. I smoothed the creased paper out flat on the kitchen counter right next to the massive settlement check. It was an informational pamphlet for a highly respected local technical trade school. I told Mr. Hayes my exact plan. I decided to use the settlement funds to fully fund a comprehensive scholarship program. I was establishing a permanent financial grant specifically designed for underprivileged minority students who wanted to learn essential blue-collar trades. I was going to use my wealth to build up the exact same hard-working community that Jalen had viciously mocked and utterly despised. I walked outside with Mr. Hayes and grabbed my silver pen. I signed my name with absolute pristine clarity on the final legal recovery document right on the rusted steel hood of my old work truck. Suddenly, my cell phone began to vibrate violently in my pocket. I pulled the device out and stared at the glowing screen. The caller identification displayed an incoming automated call directly from the county correctional facility. Jalen was desperately using his one single phone call. 6 months had passed since I let that prison phone call ring out into the silent kitchen. I sat comfortably in my worn leather recliner and stared at the bright television screen in my living room. The local evening news broadcast was running a dedicated segment on the spectacular downfall of a prominent regional real estate syndicate. The polished news anchor spoke with a serious cadence as courtroom sketches flashed across the screen. Arthur and Megan had officially received their federal sentencing earlier that morning. The judge had shown absolutely zero leniency for their calculated financial predation. Arthur was sentenced to 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary for orchestrating a massive international money laundering operation and conspiracy to commit fraud. His elite, untouchable facade was permanently, completely destroyed. Megan received an 8-year federal sentence for her direct role in washing the stolen funds to clear her hidden credit card debts. The broadcast showed a brief video clip of her being escorted out of the federal courthouse. She was entirely stripped of her lavish designer gowns and expensive jewelry. She wore a standard-issue heavy orange jumpsuit and kept her head bowed in absolute utter disgrace as the cameras flashed aggressively in her face. Then the news anchor shifted the broadcast to my biological son. Jalen had stood before the strict federal judge and desperately pleaded for mercy. He received a harsh 10-year sentence for the direct elder exploitation and wire fraud that he actively committed against me. The judge explicitly cited the heinous nature of stealing a disabled father's retirement funds as the primary justification for the maximum penalty. The legal system had systematically and completely crushed their collective arrogance. They were no longer wealthy, untouchable socialites dictating the rules of high society. They were just 3 broke, convicted felons locked away in concrete cells. Their fraudulent empire was entirely dissolved, and their toxic legacy was permanently erased from the world. I picked up the remote control and turned the television off. The screen faded to black, leaving the house in complete tranquil silence. I felt a profound sense of absolute closure wash over my entire body. Justice had been fully and mercilessly served. The sharp smell of cut lumber and hot welding metal filled the massive open warehouse. I stood proudly behind a solid wooden podium at the center of the local technical trade school. Dozens of young, eager students sat in rows of folding chairs looking up at the small stage. The school director had just introduced me to the assembly. I adjusted the microphone and looked out over the diverse crowd of hard-working young men and women. I held a thick sealed envelope in my right hand. I spoke clearly into the microphone and officially announced the inaugural launch of the Yvonne Memorial Scholarship. I explained that this permanent financial grant was specifically created to fully fund the education and training of underprivileged minority students who possess the drive to master essential blue-collar trades. I called the first recipient's name aloud. A young man stepped out of the front row and walked up the wooden stairs. He wore a simple, faded flannel shirt and scuffed work boots. He approached the podium with a posture of deep, sincere respect. I handed him the heavy envelope containing his full tuition and living stipend for the next 2 years. He reached out and gripped my hand in a firm, calloused handshake. His eyes were wide with genuine, unadulterated gratitude. He softly thanked me and promised that he would not waste this massive opportunity. I looked at his rough hands and saw the exact same honorable dedication that Jalen had so violently despised. I finally realized that a true, enduring legacy is not created by sharing blood with greedy, entitled offspring. A true legacy is actively built by empowering and elevating those who genuinely respect the brutal, honest value of hard work. I drove my heavy steel work truck back to my quiet suburban neighborhood. The late afternoon sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a brilliant wash of orange and golden light across the familiar rooftops. I parked in my concrete driveway and walked up the front steps to my solid wooden porch. I sat down heavily in the sturdy rocking chair I had built decades ago. The evening breeze rustled gently through the large oak tree in the front yard. I looked at the pristine exterior of my family home. I was entirely alone in the house, but I did not feel a single ounce of the crushing, oppressive loneliness that had suffocated me immediately following Yvonne's passing. I felt an incredibly deep and impenetrable sense of absolute security. I had surgically and ruthlessly cut the toxic cancer completely out of my life. Jalen's endless financial drain and continuous emotional manipulation were entirely severed. I had successfully protected the sacred memory of my late wife from being sold off to fund a fraudulent illusion. I had aggressively defended the physical sanctuary where we had shared our greatest joys. More importantly, I had fiercely protected my own personal dignity against a calculated predatory siege. The house stood behind me as a fortified sanctuary of peace rather than a vulnerable target for greedy thieves. The absolute silence of the evening was no longer a harsh reminder of my isolation. It was a beautiful testament to my enduring strength. I rocked slowly back and forth on the wooden boards and watched the vibrant colors of the sunset slowly fade into a deep, calm twilight. The chaotic storm had permanently passed. I reached down to the small wooden table beside my rocking chair and picked up my ceramic mug. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the fresh black coffee. The dark, roasted liquid warmed my throat against the crisp, cooling evening air. I took a deep, steady breath and let the clean oxygen fill my lungs completely. There was absolutely no more suffocating anxiety gripping my chest. There were no more frantic phone calls demanding unearned luxury or aggressive financial bailouts. I never had to spend another agonizing second walking on eggshells around a toxic, entitled son who viewed my existence as a pathetic burden. The massive, turbulent conflict was over. The silent adjustment I had meticulously orchestrated was finally perfectly complete. I rested the warm ceramic mug on my knee and leaned my head back against the solid wooden frame of the rocking chair. I closed my eyes and listened to the gentle ambient sounds of the quiet suburban street. I felt the profound, enduring weight of my hard-won freedom settle permanently over my shoulders. I breathed in the absolute perfect peace of a man who had reclaimed his entire world. True family is never defined simply by shared biology or inherited obligation. Bloodlines do not guarantee loyalty, and DNA does not excuse predatory behavior. The greatest lesson I learned is that unconditional love must always be accompanied by uncompromising boundaries. When we blindly finance the entitlement of toxic relatives, we are not protecting them. We are actively destroying our own peace and enabling their corruption. Walking away from an abusive child is not a failure of parenting. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. Dignity is earned through honest labor, and respect must always be fiercely protected against ungrateful greed. Thank you for listening to this incredible story of reclaiming freedom and dignity. If Lamar's journey resonated with you, please leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful life stories. Do not forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Stay strong and always protect your peace.